I live on a street where nothing ever happens. That's not a complaint, not exactly. When I first moved here, I thought it was the quiet I needed. The cul-de-sac was lined with houses that looked like they were copied and pasted from the same design. Trimmed hedges, asphalt smooth as if it had been ironed. At night, the streetlights flickered on like clockwork, buzzing faintly against the silence. I used to like the walks I'd take after work, circling the block with my hands in my pockets, breathing in the smell of freshly cut grass or faint barbecue smoke drifting from someone's backyard. The neighborhood was safe, predictable, ordinary. It started one Tuesday night. Nothing special about the day. I had microwave leftovers, checked a couple emails, and decided to walk off the restlessness that had been chewing at me all evening. The air was cool, the kind where your breath doesn't show but the temperature sits right at the edge of turning. The lamps had just blinked, awake, one after another, pale cones stretching onto the pavement. I walked past Mr. Alvarez trimming one of his hedges. He had clippers in one hand, holding the other steady against the bushes he clipped. The light caught both of us, my shadow long behind me, his pinned sideways against the garage door. I glanced at him out of habit, not suspicion, and saw something that made me stop. His clippers clicked, his hand rose, his shadow's hand didn't. For a second, the silhouette froze entirely, clippers hanging limp in the air while the real man went on snipping. Then, almost lazily, the shadow's arm twitched and caught up. The delay was no more than a second or two, but I stared at it until the skin prickled along the back of my neck. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Old sodium bulbs buzzing overhead, maybe not syncing with how my eyes tracked motion. I moved on, quickening my pace, but I couldn't shake the tight coil of unease that pressed into my stomach. 2 blocks later, it happened again. A woman was walking her dog, a little mutt that tugged impatiently at the leash. She stopped, crouched to adjust its collar. I swear I saw her shadow bend down a half-beat late, knees jerking stiffly before it mirrored her crouch. I blinked and it was fine, perfectly aligned. I even stepped into the cone of the streetlight to test my own, waving an arm. Mine followed, though I thought I noticed the faintest stutter, like lag in a video call. By the time I circled home, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Lights played tricks. Maybe I was tired or just restless enough to be inventing patterns. But that coil in my gut didn't loosen. The next night, I walked again. I told myself it was to prove how silly I'd been, to show myself everything was normal. The shadows were fine at first. People watered lawns, kids pedaled their bikes, joggers passed with earbuds in. All shadows followed dutifully. I started to feel stupid for even looking. Then, under the lamp near the bend in the road, I saw Mr. Alvarez again. This time he bent to tie his shoe. His body folded naturally, head lowered, but his shadow didn't bow. It stayed upright, staring straight ahead across the street, where I happened to be walking. My heart gave a hard kick. I stopped dead. His shadow's head cocked slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, while the real man fussed with his laces. And then the shadow's arm rose. It lifted slow, deliberate, as though savoring the movement, until the hand leveled and pointed, directly at me. I stumbled back, a sound tearing from my throat before I could hold it in. Mr. Alvarez glanced up, startled. He saw me, gave a little wave with his real hand, shadow dropping into place in perfect mimicry. My stomach lurched. He must have thought I was insane, standing there frozen in the middle of the sidewalk. I forced a smile, muttered something about a stomach cramp, and hurried away. Inside my house, the walls didn't feel like protection. I pulled every curtain tight, though it didn't stop me from imagining that silhouette still standing beneath the lamp outside, finger raised. The next morning I tried to rationalize. Shadows don't think, they don't look, they don't point. I told myself maybe I saw him stretch or wave, and my brain twisted it wrong in the dim light. That was easier than the alternative, but once you notice something like that, you can't unnotice it. The following nights I looked at every shadow I passed. Most were fine, a few weren't. A man carrying groceries swung his arm, but his shadow's bag jerked a second too late, like it was attached by a faulty string. A jogger's ponytail bobbed, while her shadow's hair hung stiff and still. Little things, but once I saw them, they leapt out like cracks in glass. I started testing mine more deliberately, lifting a hand sharply, spinning in place. For the most part it matched, but sometimes, only under certain lamps, it lagged by a breath, just enough that I caught myself holding my breath, watching, waiting for it to betray me. The weirdest part was how no one else seemed to notice. People strolled right past, smiling politely, not flinching when their shadows jerked or lagged. I thought about mentioning it to someone, but how would that conversation even go? "Hey, have you noticed your shadow acting strange?" They'd laugh, or worse, they'd look at me like I was crazy. One evening I lingered near the cul-de-sac longer than I should have. The sun had sunk fully, leaving the lamps as the only light. A few kids were still outside, riding scooters back and forth, their parents calling for them from porches. The kids didn't look up. They didn't look at each other either. They looked down, at the ground, watching the shapes that trailed behind them, as if those shapes were more interesting than the game. One boy slowed to a stop and pointed, whispering something to his friend. I couldn't hear, but the other boy's face scrunched in fear. His scooter clattered as he bolted toward home. The first boy lingered. His shadow wasn't moving. It just stood there, straight as a soldier, even while the kid trembled. Then, without warning, the shadow bent in half, folding at the waist in a stiff bow. The boy shrieked and ran. I felt a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the night air. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just me. Kids see things adults dismiss. Their parents yelled at them to come inside, their voices sharp with impatience, not fear. None of the grown-ups had seen what I saw. I walked faster toward home, pulse hammering. My shadow stretched long ahead of me. I couldn't help staring at it, every step expecting it to lag or freeze or turn toward me. Under one lamp it seemed fine. Under the next, its head gave the tiniest tilt, a tick to the side my real head didn't make. By the time I made it to my porch, sweat slicked my palms. I yanked the door open, stepped inside, and slammed it shut, chest heaving as though I'd outrun something. My own shadow spilled into the hallway behind me, perfectly normal under the ceiling light, perfectly ordinary. But the memory of Mr. Alvarez's shadow pointing at me burned behind my eyes, and I knew what I had seen. I woke early and told myself it was because of the sun, not the picture in my head of a raised finger under a street lamp. I brewed coffee, stood at the sink, and watched the cul-de-sac through a slit in the curtains. In daylight, the place looked normal. Delivery vans, a jogger with a reflective strap, Mr. Alvarez rolling his trash bin back from the curb. My relief felt cheap, like a shop light that brightens a basement without making it safe. At lunch, I stepped outside and pretended I had an errand. I went pole to pole and copied the little yellow tag numbers into a pocket notebook. The lamp at the bend, the one where I'd seen the pointing, was 23 billions. The corner near the mailboxes was 19A. Under the noon sun, my shadow was short and sensible. I tested it anyway. Step, stop, wave. It behaved. By late afternoon, I had a plan. If I was inventing this, I wanted to know. If I wasn't, I needed to understand which lights were wrong. At dusk, I laced my shoes and walked out with the notebook in my back pocket. Sprinklers rattled, and the first lamps blinked awake, painting pale cones on the asphalt. I started at 19A, stood in the center, and raised my left hand sharply. The silhouette raised its left hand. I spun a full circle. The shadow followed, no lag. I wrote 19A, normal, and moved on. At 20C, I tried step, clap, pivot back. It matched. The old thought that I'd spooked myself crept in. But I kept going, ticking boxes like a field tech with a deadline, 21D, 22A. Normal, normal. When I stepped into the pool under 23B, my shadow stopped. I didn't catch it at first. I stepped forward, and there was a new resistance, as if I'd hooked myself to a buried cable. I stepped again, and something in my bones felt delayed, not painful but held. On the pavement, the dark version of me stretched ahead and pinned itself to the ground. I waved both arms. The black arm stayed down. I lifted a knee. The knee didn't lift. Cold wash from scalp to ankles. I backed out of the circle like someone edging from a cliff. The instant my heel touched darkness, the lamp above buzzed, flickered out for a thick blink, then flared alive. My shadow snapped into place with a violence that made me stumble. It wasn't a smooth catch-up. It slammed. The slingshot jerk rattled up through my legs and into my teeth. I caught myself on the pole, palms scraping paint. A couple pushed a stroller past. The baby blanket fluttered. They didn't see me, or the way their shadows slid a fraction too long and reeled back when the stroller wheel bumped a crack. "Lights acting up again?" a voice called. I turned. Mrs. Shue stood by her mailbox with a rubber hose, mist dampening the concrete. She waved the water off to the side like she was erasing a chalk line. "Maybe," I said. "Do you notice anything off?" "They flicker," she said after a beat. "Utility truck was here last week, converting the old ones, they said. Don't walk late. My husband tripped when it cut out." She squinted at me, then nodded and went back to watering. I moved on, testing the edges of each circle before I committed my weight. Most behaved. A few tugged at my bones the way 23 billions had, a sticky feeling I noted with single words: drag, skip, avoid. Near the pocket park, a teenager practiced kickflips. His board slapped concrete, trucks rattled. He popped the deck to his hand and gave me a non-committal grin. "You see that?" he asked, and flipped again. I saw his real feet land clean. His shadow's legs tangled for a beat too long, then smoothed like a pulled sheet. "You almost ate it," I said. "Nah," he said, pushing off, the wheels humming. Under one lamp, the shadow lagged half a breath. In the next, it snapped to his feet. I was halfway home when a child screamed, not theatrical, a thin, terrified sound that slices whatever you're thinking. I broke into a jog. The scream came again, shorter, then urgent gasps. There. The convenience store lot at the edge of the neighborhood had 2 lamps and a floodlight over the door. A knot of people stood near the brick wall. An older man holding a bag of ice that dripped down his wrist, a teenage cashier in a thin jacket, a woman with a boy in a yellow raincoat who pressed himself into her hip. "What happened?" I asked. "They were crawling," the boy said, pointing at the bricks. "It was a truck shadow," the woman told him. "No truck," the cashier said quietly. "I was restocking. Came out when he yelled. Nothing in the lot." I looked at the wall. Floodlight washed it, stretching our silhouettes into wrinkled patches. Those made sense. What didn't were the other dark shapes moving along the mortar lines like slick hands. They were low and jointed, sliding with a wrong kind of intent. No bodies cast them. They advanced when light shifted and went still when it steadied, as if their logic was angle and reach. For a second I told myself they were bugs, but there was no skitter. A car passed on the road, and headlights sent a ribbon of brighter light across the wall. The crawling smears lengthened into crude torsos, rose half upright in bad posture, then collapsed to narrow streaks when the beam moved on. One paused and lifted an arm shape that spread flat and wide, fingers splayed as if feeling brick through glass. The boy sobbed. "They went in the holes," he said. "They went in and they're waiting." "There aren't holes," his mother whispered. "Halloween projector," the older man said, as if a season fixed anything. "There's no projector," the cashier said. I could see the lamp's housing, the clean cone of light. No lens, no dusty beam, just illumination in the absence where it failed. We watched another minute that felt longer than that. The shapes didn't perform for us. That was what made my stomach turn. They moved with a purpose that ignored us. A compact sedan swung into the lot and braked crooked. Headlights swept the wall and made everything worse. The crawling silhouettes stretched tall, like figures pulling themselves upright. For 3 beats, a black headless torso leaned long across brick, towering over the actual man getting out. Then the lights shut off, and the tall smear collapsed and slid into the floodlit baseboard. "What the driver said. No one answered. The woman hustled the boy toward their car, promising hot chocolate. The older man hugged his ice. The cashier looked at me and lowered his voice. "You live here?" "Yeah." "Get home before the lamps start stuttering," he said. "It's worse when they stutter. How do you know that?" He kept watching the wall. One of the thin smears lifted an inch, testing the bright like a blind thing. "You see between the beats," he said. On the walk back, I hugged the darkness between the circles and skirted the parts where the light reached. The wrongness under 23 billions felt like a bruise I didn't want touched. I thought about my frozen shadow, about the whip-snap catch-up, about the wall where movement didn't belong to bodies. It wasn't a screen. It clung to light the way mold clings to damp. Near the park, a mother buckled her toddler into a minivan. The dome light blinked on, spilling a soft rectangle. A black smudge slid into it along the curb as if attracted, pressed there, and thinned when she shut the door and the light died. She didn't see. I wanted to knock out every bulb on the block. Instead, I kept moving because I didn't know how to explain any of this without sounding unwell, and because stopping meant standing under a lamp. At my driveway, I paused and looked back. Lamps hummed. A moth circled one. A dog barked once and went silent, as if even animals were learning new rules. Across the street, wind chimes clattered, then stopped the moment the lamp flickered. Nothing moved that shouldn't. My hands trembled when I fit the key in the deadbolt. I left most lights off and let the kitchen nightlight lay a small triangle on the floor. My shadow pooled there. I lifted my hand. The floor ghost lifted its hand. I set the notebook on the counter and wrote, 23 billions freezes, flicker snaps, convenience store wall, unattached movement, avoid stutter. It didn't add up yet. I only knew it was getting harder to pretend nothing was happening, and harder to guess who would believe me if I tried. When I peeled the curtain back a finger's width, 23 billions hummed at the bend. The pavement under it looked like it was holding its breath. I didn't sleep much. Every time a car passed, its headlights ghosted across my ceiling, and I counted the seconds until the beams were gone. In the morning, my phone was already blinking. The neighborhood app stacked with posts: lost cat, midnight, black with white paws, please check garages, anyone else's kid talking about flat people, streetlight, 23 billions buzzing loud, can someone report? A thread argued about new bulbs versus old, whether the HOA had cheaped out. No one mentioned pointing or crawling, or the way my bones had felt tethered under that cone. Mrs. Shue had hung a missing poster on the community board by noon. Her niece's cat, a stocky tuxedo, and a blurry photo. A second paper went up an hour later for a beagle named Chips. Under both, someone had written in tidy pen, please check between fences. I walked past and felt the heat bounce off the pavement through my shoes. The shadows lay short and blunt. Sensible. Kids, though, don't care about sensible. A pair of elementary schoolers kicked a ball back and forth in the patch of shade under a tree and refused to step into the sun stripes on the sidewalk. When the ball rolled too far and settled in a bright patch, they stood there crying until a teenager trotted over, scooped it up with a theatrical shudder, and carried it back like a bomb. Their mother called thanks. The teenager shrugged and kept going, board under one arm, earbuds in. I tried to work. Reading emails felt like reading a different language. Every paragraph bled into a picture of brick wall and crawling dark. By late afternoon, I needed an excuse to walk. The convenience store's fridge hummed with a broken seal rattle. I told myself I was going for batteries, the good kind, because later felt like an important thing to plan for. The lot looked brighter than yesterday, like someone had installed a new bulb. The floodlight over the door washed the brick and made it flat white. The air smelled like hot asphalt and fryer oil. A woman in scrubs fished for change in her cup holder and left her car idling crooked in a slot. One lamp at the edge of the property cast a clean oval that wobbled whenever a truck passed on the main road, the whole pool trembling like a shallow pan on a shaky stove. I stopped just outside the floodlight's reach and watched the base of the wall. At first, there was nothing. Then a dark shape thinned along the mortar at ankle height, tracing the rectangle where the stucco met the sidewalk. It moved not like an animal, but like poured oil finding low points. When a sedan rolled through and its headlights threw longer shadows from the parking sign, the thin smear bulged and rose, rolling upward into a vertical slash. It paced the edge of light the way a stray dog paces a fence. I told myself I was being dramatic. It's just a trick, I said under my breath, because hearing it out loud was supposed to make it true. The cashier from last night came outside with a broom. He lit a cigarette he probably wasn't allowed to light by the door and stared at the wall, broom bristles hovering a fraction off the ground. "You again?" he said softly. "Just batteries," I said, and looked past him at the brick. "Sure," he said, not moving. He flicked his ash into the wedge where the wall met the sidewalk. The ash streaked the floodlit ground and made a brief gray scratch that the thin dark immediately flowed around. It avoided the ash like it was an obstacle and kept tracing the line where brightness ended. A shadow was pacing. Not long, no head, nothing you could point to in a courtroom. But it moved the way things that wait move. The teenager from earlier rolled up then, wheels clicking on the curb cut. Same kid with the board, same non-committal grin. He saw the cashier, tipped an invisible hat with the nose of his deck, and pushed through the light. When the wheels crossed the bright, his silhouette flattened sharp on the concrete. That's normal. We all know that picture of ourselves, bent and elongated. But his feet hit the oval under the lamp, and his shadow didn't slip beneath him. It stuck where the wheels first touched and stretched like gum. He didn't notice until his board jerked weird under him. He made a sound, half annoyance, half surprise, and hopped off. The board rattled to his side. He dragged his foot to pull it back and his body came, but his shadow didn't. It tethered to the ground in a shape like a footprint spread too wide, and then more of him kept trying to move while the flat part held. "What the?" he started, and then the light above the lot stuttered. It wasn't a full outage, not the long blink I'd felt at 23 billions. It was a quiver in the ballast, a dip and surge. The oval of light rippled. His silhouette jerked. It should have floated under him like a puppet's cloth. Instead, it rose up on the ground, which is a sentence that doesn't make physics sense until you see something trying to be three-dimensional without the right tools. The black his body on the pavement swelled and thinned, and the more he pulled back, the more of him dragged a shade duplicate forward. He screamed. It stripped every sound out of the lot. Cars on the road became silent shapes behind glass. The cashier's cigarette ash fell and didn't break when it hit. The kid clawed at the air and got nothing. The flatness had his ankles now, not wrapped like hands, not even recognizable shapes, just a pressure I could feel from 10 feet away, like a vacuum. He fell, palms slapping hard. That should have made a body's shadow more clear, more stable, I thought stupidly. But the shadow kept its own rules. It latched him down like he'd stepped in tack and the whole ground was sticky. "Hey!" I shouted and lunged. My knees hit the bright. Heat crawled into my jeans. I grabbed his forearm. He was real and solid and shaking. I braced my feet and pulled. There was resistance, not from his weight, but from something that dragged the other way without mass. Not a rope, not a hand, a persistence. My tendons sang. It felt like the opposite, magnets, like everything about the spot wanted him there. "Get up!" I yelled into his face. He tried, shoulders heaving, breath coming in little barks. Tears leapt to his eyes and blew away in the heat. The oval of light stuttered again, a quick dip that made the edges feather. When it surged back, his forearm went thin beneath my fingers. I've tried to say this in my head in a better, less ridiculous way, but there isn't one. His arms spread, not wider like swelling or narrower like a noose, flat. The skin under my fingers slicked into a plane. I tightened my grip without meaning to, and my fingers slipped. A layer of him shaved thinner and stretched toward the road. He thrashed and made a raw sound I still hear. The board clacked off my shin and skittered into the dark beyond the lamp where it spun to a stop. The cashier stepped forward, broom useless in his hands, and then stepped back like the light had gotten taller. "Turn it off," I shouted at him. "The light. Kill the switch." "There is no switch," he said, which is true for floodlights on automatic sensors. He glanced up anyway, as if enough staring might burn it out. "It's on a timer," he said, voice shaking. The boy kicked. His shoe peeled away. Not off, away, like a sticker lifting by its heel. The sneaker hissed across the concrete, stretching, and then snapped, empty laces curling like dead vine. The foot inside it thinned and dragged after it. He clawed for me with his free hand, and I caught it and then lost purchase because what I was holding wasn't holding me back anymore. It was losing dimension in my palm. "Please," he said, and the way he said it cut something in me. I let go with one hand and slapped the concrete next to his trapped arm. Heat bit my skin. I shoved my palm into the bright until my shadow overlapped his. It felt like pressing into a swarm of invisible gnats. Tiny pricks, a hum, a pressure that didn't exist in air or water. I pushed farther, desperate for something to give, and a cold ache sank into the bones of my hand. "Get out of there," the cashier said. "It's pulling." The oval rippled again. Headlights washed the lot as a truck passed, stretching the shapes. Everything in me said to let go when my ring dug into my finger bone, and the metal went from warm to biting. I kept hold for 2 more seconds because letting go felt like signing something. Then my grip failed. His hand in mine went from wet and hot to weirdly dry, and then there wasn't a hand. There was a slick of dark like oil that slid flat out from under my fingers and toward the curb. He didn't vanish with a pop or flash. He thinned, sheeted, and slipped. I saw his shoulder melt toward his own pavement outline. His face went wrong, not in shape, but in the way light found it, the way it didn't. He made one last jerk. The light above buzzed, a hard insect whine, and he was not there. I fell back into the dark, spine punching the lot. The world returned with a wall of sound, road noise, a car door, the cashier swearing without picking a word. The skateboard spun lazily in the shadow and tipped over. The sneaker lay on its side like a shed shell. For a second I couldn't make my lungs work. When they did, I tasted metal. My hands shook so hard it looked like I was rejecting them. I crawled forward on knees to the very edge of the bright and stuck my fingertips into it. The light was just light. Warm, insect buzzing. The ground hummed under my nails, a vibration I couldn't feel on the dark side of the line. The cashier made a noise deep in his throat. "Don't," he said. I withdrew my hand. The skin looked normal. The cold ache held on inside the bones like a bruise. The woman in scrubs had gotten out of her car and was holding her keys like a weapon. She looked at the empty patch and then at us and shook her head like she could jar the picture out. "I'm calling," she said. "Who?" the cashier asked, so tired you could hear the line of it. "Someone," she said, dialing. She paced 3 steps into the dark, away from the light, away from the spot. She began into the phone and then stopped. Her eyes skipped over the sneaker and the board and the way the concrete under the brightest part of the pool looked slick, like it had been oiled and then dried in heat. "There was an accident," she said finally, voice small. "At the Sunrise Mart. Someone is missing. Send someone." I stood up slowly and walked around the bright, careful not to step in it, and crouched by the board. The top was rough with grip tape, the edges clean, a sticker peeling from the tail. I picked it up. It was warmer than it should have been in the late afternoon air. Sirens took a lifetime to grow into real sound. By the time red lights bounced off the storefront glass, the oval under the lamp looked as innocent as a stage. People were already rehearsing what they would say. "What happened?" a cop asked. "He fell," the woman in scrubs said. "Into what?" "The light," the cashier said in a voice that would make anyone write him off. The officer's pen paused halfway through making a note. He glanced at me. "You called it in?" "I didn't," I said. "I tried to pull him." I held up my palms. The skin wasn't burned, but the inside hurt. "He was there and then he wasn't." "Name?" I told him. He wrote it down. Another officer played his flashlight over the concrete, a useless gesture in that much brightness. He found the sneaker and bagged it like a shell casing. Two teenagers hovered by the curb, whispering and watching each other's mouths instead of the lot. "What do you mean, the light?" the first officer asked the cashier again. The cashier looked at him like he was asking how to explain rain. "It takes when it shivers," he said. "It took him when it shivered." I left when they started measuring nothing. The board under my arm felt like guilt. I carried it not because I had a plan, but because leaving it there felt wrong. On the way home, I passed 23 billions and didn't look up. The lamp hummed like a throat clearing. At my kitchen sink, I turned the faucet and let cold water run over my hands until the bones ached less. The skateboard leaned against the cabinets. I could imagine the kid's mother's face without wanting to, could imagine trying to tell her that her son had been pulled by light. I couldn't imagine her believing me. I couldn't imagine me believing me if I hadn't been the one with my fingers closing on a hand that went paper thin and slid away. The neighborhood thread bloomed within the hour. Anyone see a kid with a gray hoodie around sunrise? Multiple units at the convenience store. Avoid the area. Be careful of the new lamps. They cast weird shadows, migraines. Someone posted a picture of the lot, taken after the cruisers arrived. Floodlight, brick, officers, a rounded oval on the concrete that a camera turned into nothing but glare. The sneaker in a plastic bag, one officer pointing at nothing. Underneath, comments heated and broke like oil and water. I brought the board to the garage because I couldn't bear to trip over it. Now the garage felt like a confession. The dark in there was softer than the dark outside, but my body still wanted me out of every possible cone. I unplugged the motion sensor light from the ceiling for the first time since I moved in. Without it, the house changed shape. Longer corners, slower hallways. I didn't touch the curtains. I already knew where 23B stood and what it sounded like when it thought. The HOA blasted an email that afternoon with the kind of capital letters reserved for holiday parades and emergencies. Emergency Neighborhood Safety Meeting, 7 p.m., Community Room. The subject line made me want to delete it, like ignoring the envelope would stop the mail from arriving. I went anyway, not because I thought they'd fix anything, but because sitting in my kitchen listening to the hum of the fridge made my skin feel too tight. The community room was a cinder block box attached to the leasing office that had hosted birthdays and baby showers and, once, a CPR class. Folding chairs scraped the floor. A table at the front had a pitcher of water sweating into a paper towel. A projector sat like a squat frog aimed at a blank wall. Fluorescence buzzed overhead in two banks. I stood in the back because it put the most space between my body and the wall my shadow was stuck to. I watched it flatten there, too honest, too obedient. It made me distrust it more. People filled the chairs. A few of the older residents wore sweaters despite the heat. An off-duty officer leaned by the door with a stance that tried not to be official. Mrs. Shoes sat in the third row, shoulders drawn up. The kid in the gray hoodie's absence was a hole that swallowed sound. A woman with a tight bun whispered to her neighbor and kept glancing down at the floor like she was making sure something stayed attached. The HOA president, a man named Darren with a permanent salmon polo and a voice designed for announcements, tapped the mic that wasn't plugged in and said, "Can everyone hear me?" When, of course, everyone could. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We've had reports of strange activity with the new lighting, and one incident at the Sunrise Mart that we do not want to speculate about while authorities investigate. We have a representative from the City Utilities Department to answer questions, and Officer Ledesma to provide some safety guidance. The utility rep was a woman in a navy shirt with a reflective stripe on the sleeve. She had a clipboard and the tired expression of someone sworn at by strangers for a living. "We're in the middle of an LED retrofit," she said. "It saves energy and reduces maintenance. We've had some ballast issues on older poles where the drivers weren't upgraded. That can cause flicker. We have a truck scheduled tomorrow to replace drivers on poles that reported noise or strobing." "Is 23 billions on that list?" I asked before I could stop myself. She blinked. "What?" "The lamp at the bend," I said. "Tag 23 billions, her clipboard pages whispered. "It is now," she said, and added a mark. Officer Ledesma stepped forward like he was relieved to say something normal. "We recommend avoiding walking alone at night. Report any electrical issues to the non-emergency number. Supervise children. Don't," he hesitated, searching for a neutral phrase, "don't linger directly under malfunctioning lights." A murmur tugged at the edges of the room. People had questions they weren't ready to reveal to the group. Someone finally asked the wrong one. "What about what happened to that kid? Did he fall? Is there a sinkhole?" The woman's voice sharpened with the shape of fear that wants to be anger. The cashier from the convenience store hadn't come, but his words had. "It takes when it shivers. We're not going to speculate," Officer Ledesma repeated. "The area was secured. There's no hazard to vehicles or—" "What do you call a hazard to people?" someone else said. "Fluorescent bulbs make a particular sound right before they go, a high insect whine that moves into your teeth." In the moment after the question, both banks above us hit that note at the same time, heads tipped up out of habit. My stomach folded in on itself, and I looked not at the lights but at the walls where 30-40 silhouettes had been pinned in a quiet row all evening. The first flicker skimmed through them like wind through tall grass. It wasn't off-on, not at first. It was a thin shiver, a dimming you'd miss if you were writing a check. But every shadow noticed. They all lifted their heads at once. It's a stupid sentence. Shadows don't have heads to lift, but the flat ovals at the tops of each silhouette did something their owners didn't. They bent backward as if the cinder blocks had a horizon only they could see. In the real room, people looked up with eyebrows pinched. On the wall, the heads tipped back farther, throats bearing to ceilings their bodies weren't facing. 1,000-year-old fear cracked along my spine. "Did you?" someone whispered, and the second flicker hit harder. The projector, still off, cast nothing. The fluorescence surged and dipped, and the silhouettes jerked like a flock startled into flight. Hands in the row of shadows lifted like a blacked-out wave, not with their people's hands, but a second before or after, sharpening the wrongness into something that had timing. I pressed back into my corner until the cinder block texture pushed into my shoulders. The room held its breath. Darren said it's okay, in the voice of a man who cannot know that and wants to be applauded for trying. The third flicker was a full blink, a heartbeat of night. In that blink, the row of shadows let go of us. You don't understand how much a shadow depends on you until it doesn't. People were still finding their voices, still making the kinds of sounds you make in a theater when the jump scare lands, when the black versions of them stayed on the walls without them. The fluorescence came back with a surge and our bodies threw new silhouettes that landed beside the ones that hadn't moved. For 2 ticks, there were 2 of everyone. Then the wrong ones slid. They didn't fall, they traveled. A shadow hand extended along the mortar line like a glove being pulled finger first. A shoulder stretched farther than the person had shoulders for. A child's outline lifted its arm while the real child clamped both hands over their ears and screamed. On the wall, a row of heads tilted in conference with something on the ceiling while their bodies ducked. "Turn them off," the utility rep barked, "because that is what you say to a machine when it behaves like an animal." She sprinted to the breaker box behind the folding table and wrenched the panel open. Metal hit cinder block. Her hand hesitated over switches that ran the whole building. She didn't know which would kill only this room. She started throwing them anyway. Half the lights died. The row of shadows changed shape to light or fury I couldn't tell. The remaining fluorescence grew brighter with the power load. The black shapes on the wall arched their backs in a seam of motion, and every head in them turned toward the seam where wall met ceiling and watched something pass that the rest of us didn't see. A man in the second row tried to stand and his chair skidded. His silhouette caught its front edge and dragged the metal backward across the floor as if the chair shadow were a solid object. He fell, his real hand slapping tile. His wall hand reached not for the wall floor seam, but for a darker seam farther up, the strip of shadow cast by a ceiling beam. When his wall hand touched that stripe, it elongated into it like water wicking into a cloth. I moved before my mind formed the thought to move. The exit was to my right, past a stack of folded chairs and a rolling cart with a stained coffee urn. Mrs. Shu half rose as I went by. Her shadow stayed seated, head tipped back in that obscene posture like it was listening to a joke told behind the lights. "Come on," I said, grabbing her elbow. Her real elbow slid into my palm. The wall elbow didn't. It smeared upward toward the beam shadow in a slow, indecent reach. She made a sound through her teeth and came with me. The utility rep killed another bank. Half the room blacked out, the rest got mean. The silhouettes that had detached didn't drop in a satisfying way when the bulbs went. They clung to the brightness that remained like burrs. They found every strip of light, the exit sign's green rectangle, the slit where the hallway light under the door made a golden knife line on tile, the little glowing circle of the projector standby LED, and they moved toward them as if pulled on lines. The off-duty officer shouted to keep calm and did not sound calm. Someone knocked over the pitcher. Water slicked across the table and made the light in that patch jitter. The wall shadows near it trembled in a hungry cluster, fingers widening. A child shrieked a choked animal sound and dove under his mother's chair. On the wall, his shadow stood, arms at its sides, and looked up. I should have gone out the door and not looked back. I should have cut through the dark hallway and out into the dark evening and not thought about who I left behind. Instead, I saw a black hand reach across the cinder block, longer than any arm had a right to be, thinner than a line drawn with a cheap felt pen. And something in me rejected the picture of that hand touching anything alive. I pivoted to the breaker box. The utility rep's hands shook on the switches. "Which one kills the room?" I demanded. "Labeled wrong," she said, breath catching. "It's just..." I grabbed the main on instinct, the big one, the one that would take the whole building down and maybe the parking lot besides, and yanked. Everything died. It was like the sound had been a three-dimensional thing that collapsed. The fluorescence hiccuped, stuttered, went to zero. The projector's red eye winked out. The exit sign went from a soft square of color to a dead plastic plaque. The vending machine where at the far end of the hall gave up. In the black that followed, the only light was from outside, a stripe under the door where the community room opened to the lot. A hard blade of sodium-colored brightness someone had propped the door against with a wedge. That blade became the most dangerous thing in the world. On the floor, that slash painted a long triangle of brightness across the tile and up the opposite wall. Every detached silhouette that had been stapled to cinder blocks pivoted like birds to a feeder. They didn't shamble, they didn't creep, they moved with the inevitability of spills. The triangle filled with black limbs and torsos, headless, specific, wrong. "Move!" Officer Ledesma shouted, and this time his voice cracked. He shouldered through the cluster near the door and kicked the wedge. The door swung shut. The triangle shrank to a thread and then to nothing, with three flat hands still reaching for a light that no longer existed. Someone started sobbing. Someone else started laughing, which was worse. I stood with my hands still on the main, chest lurching, every body in the room suddenly freed from its doubled outline. We were all dark in the dark, equal and blind. "That breaker feeds the office," the utility rep said in the muffled quiet. "And the lot. And the "That's fine," I said. "Leave it." People fumbled for phone flashlights, others slapped their pockets like light might grow from them. "No," I said, "too sharp. Just don't." I could feel the room understand the new rule and hate it. Someone near the back started humming blindly into their hands like they could warm themselves with sound. We stayed still long enough for breathing to become the loudest thing anyone did. "Hallway's got emergency windows," Darren said finally, his voice a few steps closer to a whisper than he meant. "We can exit there. Walk slow. No phones." We went in a shuffling clot through the dark. Shoes squeaked and stuck and lifted from tile. The door to the hall opened and the gray of evening lifted the space into a softer geometry. The emergency lights in the hall should have come on when I killed the main. They didn't. The dusk outside the windows made rectangles on the floor like polite ghosts. The first window looked onto the small courtyard between the office and the pool. The pool lights were off. The water was black and still. A single streetlight beyond the fence painted an amber oval onto the sidewalk just outside the gate. In that oval, the pool fence's shadow made a neat grid that should have been a grid. It shifted like netting in a current. "Keep moving," Officer Ledesma said, and his hand touched my back in a way that thought it was guiding me and was actually making sure I was in front of him. When we reached the outer door, we hesitated again. Night had decided to go ahead and happen while we were inside. The lot was a patchwork. One pole dark, the next blazing, another buzzing like a wasp nest. I could see 23B's twin near the corner. The same housing, the same useless hum, people clustered behind me, waiting for a leader who would not be me. I didn't have a plan beyond not being under any cone of light if I could help it. "Exit in pairs," the officer said. "Stay together, stick to the dark, don't run." We bled out onto the sidewalk like ink. The lot's bright ovals made zones we had to arc around. The piles of our shadows were wrong. When we touched those edges, I could feel the tug at my bones again and my feet sped up without my permission. We detoured through darkness between cars and into the alley that spit out onto the main road, and every time someone's phone lit up with a panic thumb, a dozen shapes in the distance jerked their attention toward that small square of light and took 3 steps and then stopped when it died. At the mouth of the alley, the sky opened a little and let in that near-night wash that is not truly light and not truly dark. The overheads on the main road were steady. They cast long, authoritative shadows that looked too defined. People broke off toward their houses in clumps. I turned for home with the same unease as putting your back to a dog. By the time I reached our cul-de-sac, most porch lights were on. The neighborhood had tried to protect itself with brightness because that's what you do when you're scared. You add light. The result was worse. Each soft cone made a trap for motion to gather. Across the street, a woman with the tight bun, the one who had whispered through the meeting, stood on her walkway talking on her phone. She paced into and out of the trapezoid from her porch fixture. In the light, her shadow crawled on the brick like it wanted to get onto the house. "I'm fine," she said into her speaker. "No, it's just, don't come over. Stay at Mom's." In her light, the silhouette of her shoes looked like they were glued there. When she stepped out of the cone, the shadow didn't follow her. It stayed by the door like a welcome mat. She didn't look down. Why would she? She looked at the street where I was, and I looked at the shape by her threshold, and the 2 pictures made a heat in my throat. I went up my own walkway and kept my eyes on the ground, taking each step like the sidewalk might suddenly decide to change its contract with gravity. Behind me, 23 billions hummed at the bend. The air carried the sound different now. It sounded like it was pleased with an idea it was about to try. I didn't go inside right away. I stood on the porch with my key in the lock and listened to the neighborhood decide what to do with the dark. Porch fixtures flicked on, turned the stucco into chalk, made trapezoids on the walkways that looked like traps. Someone across the cul-de-sac tried their motion sensor 3 times and then left it on steady. In the quiet after the community room and the breaker's thunk, the lamp's insect buzz sounded like a language nobody wanted to admit they understood. The woman with the tight bun finished her call and tucked her phone into the pocket of a cardigan she hadn't been wearing earlier. She was one of those people who moved like she owed neatness to the world. Her porch light made a polite cone that stopped just shy of her steps. When she paced to the edge of it and back, the dark version of her didn't always come with her. It clung to the threshold as if it liked the aluminum strip at the base of the door, the line of it, the way light met metal. When she stepped out of the cone to grab a package, the shadow stayed where the welcome mat would have, a flat person waiting by her door. She never looked down. I went inside then because watching felt too much like spying, and because looking at other people in their light was like looking at their throats. I shut the door soft and didn't turn on the overhead. The kitchen nightlight threw its gentle triangle and found the corner of the trash can. My shadow slid there, honest, uncomplicated. I watched it anyway, waiting for the minute I could no longer trust it. The first flicker came from down at the bend. I didn't see it, I felt it. My cabinets gave a tiny sympathetic tick, the way wood pops when the house breathes. Outside, there was a faint chorus of chain-link fences ringing once each as they changed their mind about how to be solid. I didn't know that's what I was hearing until later. At the time, the sound just pried my jaw open and held it for a second. I found myself moving back to the window despite every muscle that remembered the wall in the community room. I pinched a one-finger gap in the curtain and leaned close enough to smell the dust. 23 billions glowed steady. The air around it looked too still, like a picture that nobody had told to start. The tight bun woman paced again. She had her keys now, and her bag, and the tired posture of someone who decides to leave and then delays the leaving with small tasks. She stepped into her cone, stepped out, back and forth, while the dark person by her threshold didn't move at all. "Don't," I said, uselessly. She locked the door behind her, turned to face the street, and took 2 steps away from the house. Her shadow stayed at the door, full length, precise, a dark cutout on the stucco and the concrete. It should have slid under her, stretched, reattached. It didn't. It held to the threshold like a sticker with perfect adhesive, not torn at all by her leaving. She didn't look back. She walked across the little rug of light on her stoop, then over the seam into the darker part of the walkway, and when she did, her shadow didn't follow in any direction. It simply wasn't with her anymore. She made it to the driveway before something in her body recognized a wrongness it couldn't name. She paused by the hood, keys whirring between her fingers, and glanced at the ground like a person who thinks they saw a bug. Whatever her brain expected to see there wasn't there. She looked confused for a second in the way that comes before fear. She took another step. Her porch light flickered, one moth-breathed quiver. The dark cutout by her door rippled, as if a wind only it could feel moved across it. It unglued with the soft care of a careful hand lifting wallpaper. It slid off the stucco, poured across the aluminum strip, and lay itself out on the step like a person deciding to stretch. She hadn't turned around. She never saw it leave. I did. My finger dug a crescent in the curtain. The shadow paced to the edge of the top step and then down the next like it had to learn stairs. It did that thing I hated, that wrong head tilt back like it was listening to a ceiling it didn't have. When her porch fixture stuttered once more, the flat thing gained ground like a spill does when you bump the pan. By the time she reached the car door, it was at her gate. It paused there, not because gates matter to flat things, but because the light line there did. It slid along the line, and then over it and into the darker yard like water leaving tile for grass. She opened the driver door and dropped her bag onto the seat. I thought about the community room, about how everything that wasn't nailed to darkness wanted light. Here, the light was a leash. When she stepped back to close the door, her foot caught her own shadow as it brushed her shoe, except her real shadow wasn't there to trip over. She wobbled and laughed, a small embarrassed laugh that showed in her shoulders and not in her mouth. She turned to look at the steps she'd just left. She saw nothing. Of course she saw nothing. The flat person was standing behind her in a brightness she wasn't looking at. The porch light went steady then, and the little disasters took a breath. My body wanted me to scream her name even though I didn't know it. I didn't. My throat made a dry click I hoped windows couldn't carry. She slid into the driver's seat, set the keys on her thigh, and sat for a second like she was remembering something about the route or about which bag to bring. Her body faced forward. On her stucco, the shape that used to belong to her looked at her front door. The next flicker didn't come from 23 billions. It came from her fixture. I didn't know a simple porch light could flicker like that. Maybe it wasn't a simple porch light anymore. The cone on her stoop trembled, broke, returned, a strobe just quick enough to make every line meet the next wrong. The flat person stepped off the step. It didn't cross the yard. It didn't need to. It went where there was brightness. The pool on the walkway, the little island thrown by the yard lamp last owner had left at the corner. It walked from island to island like a person who couldn't get their shoes wet. When it reached the strip of light under her cracked garage door, it turned its head toward the sound of her engine coming alive and then kept moving toward the line at the base of the door, thin and bright as a blade. I moved without choosing to. I opened my door and stepped into my own trapezoid and felt it drag at my bones and stepped out again with a curse. The urge to yell her name or slam something or break a bulb fought with the rule I hadn't written down yet. Don't give them light. I ran down my stoop and into the slice between cones so fast I clipped my shoulder on the mailbox. She put the car in reverse and backed out without seeing me. The headlights swung and drew long white stripes across her garage and over her front steps and across the street and up the neighbor's siding. Every place the white hit, the wrong shapes rose like grass in a wind. Her shadow, no longer hers, not anchored by her body, lifted under the headlights and stood in the beam with the posture of someone who had been tall once and remembered it badly. It had a neck without a throat and shoulders that made a line without bones. In the next instant, the headlights moved, the posture collapsed, and it became a smear again. She braked hard and swore, her voice loud in my driveway because of course I was outside now. Of course someone was.
Sorry,
I said automatically, stupidly, and held my hands up like a pedestrian in a crosswalk, like a person with reason. She waved me past, then put the car in drive and rolled toward the mouth of the cul-de-sac. That's when her porch light died for real. No quiver, no stutter. A tired final blink. The shadow stopped midway between her gate and the garage door in the strip that used to be bright. For a beat it was nothing but a darker tone on darker concrete. Then 23 billions down at the bend hummed louder, the way a throat does when it is about to sing, and the cone it cast leapt a hair brighter. The flat person turned. It wasn't facing a person, it was facing a quality. It took 3 steps across nothing and reached the street. The next cone took it, then the next. It made its way to the cul-de-sac not by touching earth, but by choosing light, the way a certain kind of moth will kill itself touching heat. She drove out. I remembered to breathe. My stomach turned as if gravity had swiveled. I wanted to go kill her porch bulb with a rock. The desire came with a picture of the rock throne, the broken glass sparkling in a wider pool of brightness on the steps, the flat thing with more to stand on. I swallowed the desire like a stone. Sirens had been a long smear lately. That night they were immediate again. A cruiser rolled into our circle and parked badly, one wheel on the curb. The officer inside barely had the car in park before he was out and telling us to go inside. I wasn't sure if he meant because of what had happened at the community room or because of something else. He looked at 23 billions like it had failed to stop at a stop sign. Behind him, on the far side of the cul-de-sac, the tight bun woman's car taillights went small and then turned white as she changed her mind. She made the three-point turn slower than she should have, like she was thinking about the bag she'd left on the counter. She eased back into her circle and rolled toward her driveway. The officer gestured her down. She didn't see him. She was already looking past him at her house. She saw the porch, the dead light, the garage door, the empty steps. She put the car in park and left the engine on, door open, foot hesitating between brake and ground like a person testing river current. She got out finally, keyed the fob on reflex to lock the doors, and started across her own concrete. I stepped toward her without wanting to. I wanted to say, wait. I wanted to say, you don't have your, what? Her shadow. Light is out, I said instead, which was nothing, which was less than nothing. She waved once with a kindness that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the habit of being decent in front of neighbors. The officer called something about staying back. She didn't. She took the shallow step up. Her foot landed in the piece of brightness the car's interior cast onto the bottom stair. The roof light made a small square. It was enough. Her shoes stopped. They didn't catch. They didn't trip. They just ended. It took my brain 2 heartbeats to give the picture a verb. In that square of light, her feet were there until they weren't, and her shoes were there after. Her body pitched forward with a motion you'd call falling if falling had anything to hold on to. It didn't. It went thin at the ankles and then at the shins and then at the knees, as if a printer were running out of black ink in neat horizontal bands, except the bands were vertical and the ink was her. She reached for the railing. Her hand slid off into a plane before her fingers could close. She made a noise like a person trying to remember the word for help in a language they lost in childhood. Then there was air. The officer reached her in 3 strides that would have been heroic in any other story. He grabbed at her upper arms and his palms met her sleeves and then met nothing, and he fell forward to his knees in a sound like cloth, tearing that wasn't cloth. The shoes stayed. They sat side by side, neat, laces still tied. A few pebbles had scuffed into the treads when she backed out of her driveway. Those pebbles stayed too. The officer scrambled backward on hands and heels with the frantic grace of a person who finds gravity has become a suggestion. He drew his flashlight and then stopped himself, panting, remembering. He didn't point it. I reached the bottom of my steps and did not cross my trapezoid. A neighbor on the far side started screaming words that were not words. Someone else vomited into their bushes. I understood the line I had written in my head in ink, "It takes when it shivers," but it didn't have to shiver big. It only had to see what it wanted to take. Her car door was still open. The roof light made its little square. The square moved as the car's springs recovered from her weight leaving them. The square slid down the stair and pooled on the walk and then faded when the timer cut off. When the square died, something on the step moved. The shoes turned a fraction, the way empty shoes do when they settle. The shadow that had been waiting by the door was gone. I couldn't see where it had gone. I could feel it, not like a person feels a presence, like a body feels a draft when a door opens in another room. Our lamps hummed, and in their hum there was a pleasure I wished I'd never learned to recognize. Inside, the officer said, and his voice had retreated into a hallway. We didn't go. We backed instead, all of us, to our stoops. We stepped into our own trapezoids because hiding from light is a kind of surrender nobody in a suburb can do on command. I went into mine because the dark at my back was deeper than the one at my feet. I watched the bend where 23B stood, and the asphalt in its cone looked wet when it wasn't. The first time I saw it after the shoes, it came from the far curb, a sliver that didn't throw itself on the street, but investigated the seam where the curb met the road. When the lamp above it fluttered, the sliver thickened into a body without us. It circled not like a person looking for an address, but like someone learning a route by muscle memory they hadn't yet earned. It traced the cul-de-sac circle just shy of the center, using the overlaps where the cones met to make islands close enough to step to. Every time a bulb trembled, it moved farther. It didn't head straight for me. It didn't have a me. It had geometry. It measured the way brightness lapped like tide and put itself where the tide reached. It passaged the shoes without looking at them. When a motion sensor came on 2 houses down, the circle of it spun a new island, and the flat person stepped to it so fast it looked like I had blinked hard. The officer radioed words I couldn't hear because of the blood in my ears. I could hear my own house, though. The wiring tick, the refrigerator compressor deciding if it would come on, the way my stairs breathed when I put too much weight on one place. I knew those sounds too well now. If the fridge motor kicked and threw a rectangle across my tile, my kitchen would make an island. I cut it off at the plug and held the cord in my hand like a tail. The shadow circled again. It tilted its head at nothing in a gesture that said it had remembered head and was trying to prove it. It never looked up. It never needed to. Light lives down. When it reached the top of the circle for the 3rd time, 23 billion sang a note that was almost music and then wobbled. The flat person made a decision I had no business understanding and crossed the only gap between islands that had mattered all night. The stretch of street in front of my house that was darker than the rest because a branch from the big ash tree had grown fat enough to steal light. It didn't cross darkness. It crossed on a mistake the light made. The moment the cone thinned at the edge of the ash branch's shadow, the thing threw itself across the thinner place and landed on the near side with a thud my ears didn't hear but my teeth did. I went back inside and shut the door on my hands because my hands didn't want to let go of the knob. The wood found the jamb with a familiar sound I loved and was now foul. I didn't lock it. Locks are for people. I went room to room and clicked off every little light I had forgotten I owned. I slid my palms down the blinds and pulled them so tight the cords burned my fingers. The house made deeper dark than it had ever made, and still, under my front window, something scratched at the blinds like a fingernail that was graphite instead of keratin, drawing on my window instead of touching it. I stood with my back to the wall and listened to the scratch. It wasn't fingernails on glass. It was the dry graphite drag of something that wanted to be a line. It rasped up and down twice, then paused, then traced a slow horizontal as if measuring the length of the window. I flattened my palm to the drywall and felt nothing through it but the leftover cold from the breaker box. The sound came again, higher, as if it had stood on something. A car approached somewhere on the main road. Its headlights swept the cul-de-sac and turned every slat in my blinds into a white bar for a heartbeat. That was enough. The scratching slashed a diagonal. I stepped back without thinking. No plan in the step, just a primitive recoil from the way light behaved. The car went on. The room returned to black. The sound died and left its absence like steam after a kettle. Dark then. Keep it dark. The rule was so simple it made me laugh once in a way that had no humor in it. I moved through the kitchen by touching things I knew. The counter seam by the sink, the radiator notch, the useless oven clock with its stubborn 12. I pressed my thumb on that clock's power and held until the green digits surrendered. The little triangle from the nightlight still lived under the cabinet. I had forgotten to unplug it. My brain had left it flagged as gentle. I plucked it from the outlet and set it face down in the sink. The house changed shape. Hallways got longer by a foot. Corners moved in closer. Light makes you think a place is yours. Without it, you learn the truth about how much a place will let you have. I hugged the inside of the walls on the way to the living room, windows on my left, breathing shallow to keep my ears for any motor that might sweep another white stripe across the blinds. When I brushed the thermostat, its blue halo winked awake in a ring around my knuckle. I slapped it hard. It died. In the living room, I felt the couch with my shins and let myself sit because my legs needed me to pretend normal for half a second. Across from me, the second set of blinds, the ones on the big front window, wore faint lines from the street lamp, the same way fabric remembers a fold. No light was moving through them, but there was a very soft, very steady whitening of the bottom slat, like fog. I crept to it and bent until my face hovered an inch from the blinds. I kept my hands at my sides. Somewhere outside, across the street, 23B took a breath. My window did not brighten. The little fog on the bottom slat concentrated into a hard line, not light itself, but where light wanted to be. A shape lifted in the white, not outside, on my side. Just a suggestion at first, the suggestion of the heel of a palm. It rose very slowly. It pressed. It drew a line. It was a hand, and it wasn't a hand at all because I hadn't moved mine. I jerked back. The shape kept going for 2 more inches, then paused like it was listening for a cue. I forced myself to keep still. I spread my fingers wide at my sides, far from the window, and opened and closed them to prove something to myself. My breath wobbled. On the blind, the dark hand stayed pressed there, not fanning, not mirroring. It curled very slightly, enough to make the slats click against each other with a sound that made me grit my teeth. I swallowed, reminded myself of walls and angles and panes and the fact that a flat thing cannot reach into air. I stepped right, 3 quiet steps, keeping my shoulders in the dark. On the blinds, the silhouette of my head shifted left, even though I hadn't leaned near enough for light to catch me. It turned as if to follow me. "This is me," I said aloud, to test if my voice still worked. I didn't say it to the shape, I said it to my bones. Under the window, the thin rectangle of light that had been pooling like fog drew in on itself, then exhaled out into a longer strip. Something outside had moved. A porch light 2 houses over, a car cresting a distant hill. My blinds recorded the change like paper registers pressure. In the shifting, the hand shadow on my side of the slats dragged down 6 inches and then let go. The bottom slats rattled and tapped back into place. I backed into the hallway. My shoulders felt like they'd been scraped with a rasp. The bathroom at the hall's end had a small window set high for privacy. It wore a pale smear from the neighbor's porch light across its frosted glass even now. I shut the door to block it. A blade of that light still slipped under the door at the threshold, a clean, bright seam on tile. I stood over it and watched it. Darkness yawned on either side like the top and bottom jaws of something with a mouth. Without thinking, I lifted my foot to step across the seam. The bones of my ankle pulled back the way a dog's collar does when it reaches the end of the leash. I froze with my foot hanging. The tug wasn't pain, worse. It was the memory of pain, the promise of it. My shadow, if I had one, should have been my foot's honest twin, laid on the floor by some light source. There wasn't a strong enough light here to cast me. The tug didn't care. It belonged to wherever simple brightness waited. I lowered my foot back into the safe dark, and the leash feeling loosened. I crouched and ran my fingertips an inch over the seam. No heat, no hum, nothing a hand could report. When I breathed out, the seam didn't wobble. Not air then, not a trick of a vent. Just a place where the world would be willing to do things to me. I slid a bath towel against the threshold and blocked the blade. Inside the bathroom, the frosted window still painted a soft lozenge above the tub. I didn't trust it. I climbed into the tub anyway, not because it would save me, but because it had 3 solid sides and the shower curtain, pulled, made a nice lie of privacy. I dialed my phone brightness to nothing and cupped it in both hands like a contraband candle. I typed a note in the dark with my thumbs. Blind, light makes it strong, flicker makes it take, seams, door, curb, step, act like places it can cross. The words inside the phone glowed a faint gray, weaker than a dying ember. On the shower curtain, at the hem where it barely brushed the tub, a little strip of street lamp light peeped under from the window. In that strip, my phone cast the faintest shadow of my hands. I stilled them. My shadow hands should have stilled. They did not. On the curtain, the gray version of my right hand lifted its index finger and traced a slow line along the vinyl, diagonal, the way the scratch at the living room blinds had traced. I could feel the twitch in my real finger as if it wanted to copy, as if the impulse had miswired through a mirror that didn't exist. I suffocated the phone in my palms. The gray bled away. The little line on the curtain remained like a memory. "No," I said. Not to the curtain, and not to whatever watched a ceiling it didn't own. No. I tucked the phone under my leg and sat there with my breath counting itself. In that awful quiet, my house demonstrated every tiny light I'd failed to account for. The router humming with its insect-bright green wink, the smoke detector's heartbeat lead, the oven display I'd killed still breathing, a dim dot just to say I'm here, the little digital face of the microwave, the glow-in-the-dark stripe on the back door deadbolt waiting for hands at 3 a.m. I moved in a slow crawl through the rooms, killing them with tape, with towels, with my hands until the house was a cathedral to the kind of dark that hurts the eyes. Outside, 23 billion sang its note at intervals, content, and the cones shuffled, and the shapes circulated, and a fact settled into me that was more horrifying than the events had been all day. The shadows didn't care if I believed in them. They had their own rule sheet. They were working through it. The scratching at the living room came back after a while, softer. It had changed pitch, as if it had worn the paint down a layer and now touched paper. I pressed my ear to the drywall on the opposite wall to hear it through the house's body instead of through the air. Through the studs, the scrape was a whisper of sand. I went to the garage for tape. The garage was the closest thing to a good dark I had. No windows, just the door to the driveway, which had a weather strip fat enough to chew. I taped the back of the blinds in the living room like a person wrapping a bandage, and then dragged the heaviest pillows in the house against the bottom slats. I wanted to laugh at myself and couldn't find the reflex. I wanted to cry and couldn't find that either. From somewhere down the street, a landscaper's small generator coughed to life, the kind people use to power inflatables in December or to keep a fridge humming during a short outage. Its sound should have been comfort. It wasn't. The second it turned on, a wheel of brightness rolled across the sidewalk from a string of bulbs. A set of long shadows assembled on the fence and waited like men at a bus stop. I realized I could smell heat, not fire. Heat from transformers, from housings, the metallic baked scent of the new fixtures. I cracked my back door and stuck my hand out into nothing. The air was cool enough to make the hair on my arm lift. The smell was stronger. It made me think of the convenience store lot, of that oval of light like a hot plate. I shut the door. The glow-in-the-dark stripe on the deadbolt lit my palm. I covered it with a strip of duct tape and had a picture flash through my head of neighbors walking their hands along their doors tomorrow night by memory, because any little helpful line was an invitation. The phone buzzed in my pocket, the HOA thread mutating into 1,000 versions of don't and do. Someone had posted, "Utility crews back on site tomorrow 9 a.m. with a grainy photo of a bucket truck taken from the block behind us." Another comment stuttered underneath it, "Already seeing city trucks on Pine. They're testing light output now at midnight. Testing, which meant bright." A car rolled slowly down our street, idling like a parade float. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was a city truck with a ladder, 2 men in reflective vests in the cab, faces washed pale by whatever device glowed between them. The passenger hung his elbow out and looked up with the expression of a man who'd rather be under any other light in the world. "Keep it steady," he said, and the driver did something to a panel I couldn't see. 23 billions went from pleased hum to full-throat thrumming. The cone under it brightened, like a climber finding the next hold. "Don't," I said to no one the men could hear. The light surged again, then held. Across the pavement, the shapes came like water through sluice gates. They didn't pour straight under the truck. They rose to meet the new brightness, slid upright inaccurately, and fell into it again when the angle changed. The men didn't look down. They looked up at housings and bolts and the tidy blue logos on new drivers. The passenger made a mark on his clipboard. They rattled their way around the circle, stopping briefly at each pole. Every stop made the cones jump one notch brighter, like someone turning up a dimmer impatiently to finish a job. Each jump gave the oil on the street a chance to pretend to be a body for a breath before collapsing into fresh puddle. A neighbor, 2 doors down, opened his door to shout some version of "turn it off." The thin rectangle of his hall light hit the driveway. 2 long-reaching shapes snapped toward it and stopped like leash dogs when his wife yanked it closed behind him. He stood on his stoop in the dark with his mouth open and nothing in it. I realized then that my own hallway door was open a crack. The seam glowed a teenage amount, enough to make a bright line on my own tile that hadn't been there a minute ago. I went to it as if approaching someone else's infant, terrified of breathing wrong. Through the crack, a motorized sound from the street vibrated in my teeth. On the tile, my own thin dark head and shoulders outlined themselves, even though I was sideways to the door. I stilled. The thin head on the tile did not. It tipped left as if checking a shoulder I didn't offer, then tipped right like a greeting. I raised my hand to test, and then let it drop without moving, my muscles refusing to give the experiment anything to work with. On the tile, the dark hand rose to the height of the knob and spread its fingers, like someone remembering piano. My hand remained at my side, sticky with the sweat my body had saved for house fires and wolves. I stepped back. The shadow didn't care about my distance. It cared about the seam. It turned that black hand and scratched a slow line along the baseboard inside the light. I closed the door with the softest push I've ever made in my life. The line went away. A hum built outside that wasn't my street alone. You don't know you know the harmonic of a grid until crews start waking poles across a square mile at once. I could feel the added load in the way the house frames sang without sound. The truck stopped beneath 23 billions and the bucket rose, a man in it balancing the way men do at heights, loose knees, steady hands. He reached for the housing, and because men who can't see danger like to name it, he said, hearing some weird complaints about flicker, "Let's see if the driver fix does it." He clicked something. The cone under 23 billions whitened to a hard disk, bright enough to make every pebble a star. The shadows peeled. There isn't a better word. They peeled off the street and up the curb and across the front lawns like someone lifting cellophane from a cake. They didn't gain thickness. They gained speed. They rose without mass and slid without sound and found every bright plane on every car hood and every window and every mailbox and tried them as if the neighborhood were a tasting. The man in the bucket looked down then because a shape moved fast enough to concern a nervous system. He flinched so hard he clipped his wrist on the housing. His flashlight tumbled from the basket and hit the street. The beams spun circles across the asphalt and the circle got eaten. "Shut it down," the driver called up, panic making authority wobble. "Shut it, shut it, shut." The man's glove found the panel with the practiced slap of a body that wants to be back on Earth. The cone stayed white and blinding. Whatever new driver they'd put in did not speak the language of off. Farther down the block, another crew did the clever, brute version. They killed the column at the base. That cone died with a grateful sigh. In the second of soft dark after, 5 long slick shapes that had been halfway to something gave up and went to nothing, which was worse. The bucket came down. The men looked at each other, pale, pretended to gesture. The driver put the truck in gear. I stood there with my palm on my own dead thermostat and felt the neighborhood decide between flight and the job. The truck's engine grumbled, and the white disc under 23 billions stayed white, as if a coin had been dropped there and was deciding whose pocket to choose. There would be more trucks. They would arrive in a chain. They would bring more bright and more solving and more taking. I found the breaker again with my hands. The main was already down. I wanted more down, something bigger. There is no bigger for a house. There's only the way the city hums and how much of it you let in. I stood in that dark and did the only thing I could do without inventing a tool. I waited for them to move to the next pole, to the next, so I could count the tempo, so I could time the moment when the cones would be brightest and everything. And my walls would want to be a shadow. Engines multiplied. The first bucket truck's grumble got answered by another, then a third, each one backing into the circle with that beep-beep metronome that made my shoulders climb my neck. The grid hum thickened until even the drywall had a tone. Men in reflective vests hopped down talking like it was a normal job at a normal hour, and maybe for them the trick was to keep talking like that so their hands wouldn't do something smart like refuse to work. They set cones. They set up a cart with orange reels of cable and a wheeled light tower, the kind with a telescoping mast and 4 square LED heads that can make a parking lot noon. When one of them yanked the ripcord, the little generator coughed and then found its rhythm. The heads flicked on, then dimmed to bright, flashed to a white that hurt, a white with edges. I took one step back from my window and felt the house tighten. The light tower flooded the bend, the mouth of the street, half the circle, shadows peeled, not like lifting a corner of a sticker this time. Like someone had poured a thin layer of tar over everything, and the heat had gotten high enough to make it curl up in long tongues. The lines of every curb and mailbox and parked car became a mouth for something flat to crawl up and onto. It didn't fall off roofs, it slid onto them as if the shingles were waterfalls going the wrong direction. Jesus, somebody said out there, but in the tone of a man seeing a miswired advertisement, not a living thing. The bucket rose. The man in it clipped to the rail with a steel ring and said something too practical. "We'll do drivers every other pole. If we knock the harmonics down, we might cut the flicker," to the driver below. He worked his way to 23B like a surgeon taking a step he'd taken 100 times, eyes on hardware so he didn't have to look at the street, or at the way the new white carved bodies out of the dark, and let the flat shapes drape themselves over those bodies like bad cloth. Across the circle, a guy in a hard hat bent to open a base panel. His body blocked the tower's light for a second. His shadow should have lifted and hung behind him on the pole. It didn't. It spread out from his boots and crawled up his shins like his own long reflection in a perfectly still pool when you bend to touch it, except there was no pool, just bright, and the black thinness he cast wasn't a picture of him anymore. He swore and straightened, and his boots stayed glued to the concrete for a beat that was a beat too long. "Careful," his partner said without looking. "Lot of heat." "Yeah," the first guy said, trying to make his voice bored around a muscle that had just remembered flight. On the house siding across from me, darkness reached the eaves, gathered itself along the gutter, and poured over to the roof like a tongue. It didn't gather thickness. It gathered surface. You don't know you're afraid of surface until you watch it behave like muscle. My phone trembled in my pocket with a useless flood of messages. "Do not come outside, they're working on IT. Stay inside, turn on your lights." I typed with both thumbs and deleted it twice and then sent nothing. My index finger smelled like duct tape and copper. The white grew brighter. The light tower had another notch, and some man whose workday was supposed to end at 4 raised it. The shadows reached for it like plants for a window. I couldn't see the teen's shoe anymore. The stair held only 2 neat depressions that looked like the ghost of her footfall, and not like the shell they were. The officer by his crooked cruiser had his back to 23 billions now, hand on his radio, posture trying to make command out of a night that had no respect for posture. The man at 23 billions did something to the housing, and the cone under it sharpened from fog to blade. In the blade, gravel became stars, and the slick shapes rose and fell like breath. The bucket man said, "Driver swap," and reached into the metal belly with the confidence of a man who thinks wires are the only snakes he'll ever need to respect. 2 houses down, a neighbor, Jim with the 3 kids, the guy who loaned me a rake last fall, came out with a shop light. A cord snaked from his garage to the stoop, and he set the light on its little stand and faced it toward his lawn and said to his wife, "See? No more trips," which was the exact wrong thought. The beam painted a rectangle across his grass, and in it, the blades of grass all lay down toward the light and then stood again after something flat passed over them. He didn't look at the grass. He looked at his wife's mouth shaping something about the breaker popping earlier. When he turned away to run the cord in safer, his toddler clapped at the shapes moving on the white of the clapboard like cartoons. "Kill that!" the officer shouted, to no one specific, to everyone, and Jim flinched and unplugged his own problem with a hand that shook and a face that said he'd admit nothing about why. At the base of 23 billions, one of the crew set a portable halogen work lamp at knee height and aimed it up to see the pins. He clicked it on. The halogen filled the underside of the bucket with a golden wash. It made a different kind of shadow, warmer, the opposite of what the lead tower was doing. For a heartbeat, I thought the warmth might matter to the simple rule that heat would make the flatness ignore it. It didn't. The gold made honey out of treacle. It lifted the black and made it soft and thick. Two distinct shapes rose on the bucket's belly like hands pressed to a tent. The man inside finally looked down. He swore in a voice that had aged 20 years since he'd gone up. He had a wrench in one gloved hand. He clanged it against the rail without meaning to. The sound wasn't helpful. It was a noise a body makes when its animal part gets ahead of its trained part. "Shut it down!" the driver yelled again, eyes on the way the black climbed the bucket like ivy. "I'm trying," the man said, and that was the most terrible sentence of the night so far. It had the exact shape of children's voices trying to air out a closet. He yanked the disconnect. The new driver didn't care. The cone stayed white and unkind. The honey hands pressed hard enough that the bucket creaked. A guy on the ground grabbed the halogen to turn it away, and his glove cast a crisp, thick shadow across the housing, wrist hairs etched inside it like roots. The shadow moved against his glove's logic, and for a fraction his glove looked empty. He snatched his hand back with a little noise he wouldn't want named. Across the circle, another crew did what men do when a small tool fails. They brought a bigger one. They dragged a second light tower off a trailer and yanked it to life. The LED heads flared hard. The street brightened like noon dared it. The shadows peeled in sheets. They came off the asphalt in long curls and rucked up like plastic bags in wind, and then smoothed to the siding and the window glass and the gleam of car hoods. They slid along the gutter line until a downspout delivered them to driveway concrete in a black spill. They gathered in the seed shapes of people, not because they wanted people, but because light keeps making those shapes. Two of the crew were at the base of the second tower when it surged. One got a knee locked and popped himself free, a small animal movement that saved him without dignity. The other didn't. The cone thinned at the edge and lapped his boot. His leg stuck with no ceremony. When he yanked, his shadow didn't come. It stayed spread, and his thigh kept drying. His partner grabbed his harness and pulled with both hands and made no difference. "Cut it!" somebody screamed. A man at the generator panicked in the way a man does when 4 different cords look necessary and none do. He severed the one that fed the tower, and the heads went dead. The cone sank. The stuck man's shin stayed. His partner kept pulling until he realized he had a man's torso and not all the man. He let go with both hands as if he'd been burned. The stuck man looked down at himself with a face both surprised and contemptuous of surprise, the human brain making one more try at naming what it sees. He put both palms on the concrete and pushed up to free his lower legs. He lifted his upper body. His lower body didn't come. It didn't bleed. It wasn't. His top half tilted sideways like a thing losing leverage and slid across the pavement into his own shadow and went thin, and then thin into nothing. The partner sat down hard on his ass and tried to keep breathing like a person who had not just wrestled with shape. The bucket creaked again. The honey hands had become black hands, had become not hands at all, just area determined to be something. The man up there made a decision that had nothing to do with training. He unclipped and jumped. He aimed for the dark. If he'd hit it clean, I think he would have made it and broken both ankles and won something. He didn't. His heel hit the edge of the cone and left a shoe without a foot in it. The rest of him hit black and rolled, and he kept rolling until he found a bumper to stop him and lay there telling the sky that he had bones. He had a sock on one foot and nothing inside the end of it. I had my mouth open and didn't know it until my tongue dried. I shut it and tasted metal anyway. The driver in the first truck slammed the truck into reverse. The bucket arm was still half up. The back wheels hopped the curb. The work lamp toppled and the halogen head smashed and sprayed a short-lived brightness across 3 men and a mailbox, and that brightness made 3 long rising things that reached for what had just been given to them and got nothing when the filament died. The driver yanked the column base door open and ripped the main cutout with both hands. The cone under 23 billion stuttered to gray like a sun going behind a cloud. 5 slick shapes that had been mid-rise puddled and ran back into the cracks. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound of a neighborhood holding its body away from its own shadow. Up on the roof across from me, the gutter line had collected something. It wasn't full, it was lined, like a trough. Every time a surge came from a pole up the block, the trough lifted a little wave that lipped the shingles and went over. When it went over, it didn't fall like water. It found the downspout seam and ran everything it was down that seam and across the driveway and into the car's chrome. The chrome turned it into a knife that rode itself along the car's side. The officer had stopped shouting. He had lost his radio to the gravity of not assets. He walked backward with his palms out as if to press the air into a shape and glanced at the houses like the houses might take pity if looked at right. He didn't step into any cones. That was the only reason he kept his thickness. Neighbors had opened doors to look, because that is what the body does when the mind should hide. Porches bloomed. Every bloom attracted a dark insect like a trick eye drawing. Some of those insects grew into nobody. You could see the moment a human skull inside a human head understood that the shape leaning on their own siding wasn't theirs. You could see the way the body wanted to get small in a corner of the interior instead of at the threshold. A few people shut their doors. A few couldn't teach their hands to move. The city crew regrouped in a knot by the truck. The foreman, this one had a mustache too black to trust, said words like shut the circuit at the node and isolate the segment and pointed toward the top of the street as if the node were a wild dog that could be fenced. A man with bleeding palms nodded because nodding is what you do when language is the only tool left. They made for the intersection in a caravan. As their taillights went white, the cones they left behind dimmed to their old bad. The white coin under 23 billion stayed because the base cut hadn't convinced it. It had opinions now. On my own roof, the troughing sound thinned. The scratching at my window quieted to a mouse's self-soothing. I knew the quiet for what it was, a think. The neighborhood had become a board, and the light had become the pieces, and whatever rode those pieces had just watched 2 men get thinner than breath without bleeding. It would not get less curious. Something moved in my eaves, not weight, surface. A long brush of black tried the vent slats on for size and then left when the slats refused to be a plane. It made the faintest tick as it slid across the aluminum flashing. It found the downspout seam and tried it. It found the edge of my kitchen window and rode along the weather strip with a pencil sound. It left nothing you could photograph. Down the block, the second light tower tried to come back to life on a sad last breath of fuel, coughed once, and died. In the pail it made on its way out, I watched 2 slick shapes that had been half legs flow into each other and then separate as if they'd only paused to compare notes. My eyes ached. I pressed my thumb and forefinger into the bridge of my nose and saw static. When I opened them, the room hadn't changed, which felt like a win. The trucks at the intersection killed a section of the grid finally. I could tell by the drop in the house frame's tone. The far end of the street went dim, like the picture had been lowered into a bath and partly lifted out again. In that dim, The rooftops looked like normal rooftops. The gutters held only water and pine needles. Even 23 billions, coin thinned and slunk back to a meaner white. The flat shapes retreated not in fear but in boredom. They kept close to whatever bright remained. The officer's dashboard screen, the halo of a neighbor's microwave somebody had forgotten, the pale forearm of the foreman pointing at his clipboard with the LED headlamp he'd left on his own head. They weren't gone. They had stepped off the board while the board reset. I stood with my palm on the wall and felt the hum slide a note lower. I could hear the men at the top of the street arguing with the kind of control that keeps hands from shaking. I could hear my refrigerator deciding it was allowed to try and then refusing. I could hear the roof, 5 inches over my scalp, whisper the length of something slick looking for the next seam and finding nothing that would let it be more than a line. The hum bled out of the walls until the drywall stopped singing and the neighborhood exhaled a breath we'd all been holding wrong. Up at the intersection, a whole block went dark like a lid closing. Down here, the light towers died, the cones thinned, and the street fell back to the old yellow truth of what the lamps had been before someone tried to improve them. 23 billions kept its coin for a stubborn minute, then sulked to a weaker white. The crew trucks idled, conferred, and then rolled off to chase the node with a caravan of cones and hope. The change didn't feel like safety. It felt like a pause. Porch lights snapped off house by house, not all at once, not by instruction, but by people who had watched shoes stay on steps and could learn. Those who didn't learn were made to. I saw a shape reach for a switch and then not reach again. After that, darkness accomplished a kind of order nobody would have voted for if daylight had been in the room. I paced the inside of my house until the map of it burned in my feet. 5 steps to the hall, 3 to the bathroom, 8 to the living room corner, where the wall meets the window casing, and the floor siding has a nail that was never flush. I kept a hand on the paint most of the time. In the dark, your hand is your oldest tool and your newest friend. Outside, the absence made other sounds louder. The crickets began again, massive and cheerful and oblivious. Somewhere far off, a dog did the arithmetic of before and after and came up with a new place to bark from. Tires hissed on wet asphalt on the main road. Somewhere had gotten rain, maybe just enough to flash the oil into rainbow. Here the air felt full and ready. The officer's cruiser door thumped. He'd stayed. He shouldn't have. He moved by intuition now, skirting cones that weren't there anymore by the memory of where they had been. He lifted his radio to his mouth, then lowered it again, remembering the small screen's glow. His silhouette touched a slice of light spilled from a neighbor's uncurtained window, and I almost shouted, but he saw it too. He pivoted away and breathed like a man who had made a good choice. The first phone screen had to come from someone new to the block, someone who didn't know the thing we now knew. It flared bright like a fish scale's flash. An island appeared 2 doors down where the woman on the second floor lifted her phone to her face. Her living room cast a rectangle onto her carpet. The rectangle lifted a slick person out of it like a magician making a silk stand-up. It pressed its non-face to her glass. She screamed. Screen dropped, and the rectangle died, and the standing silk puddled in a way that did not make her braver. "Turn them off," someone hissed at the darkened general, which is like hissing at the ocean. Across the circle, a match slid against a striker and gave a small orange. It traveled to a wick. The wick bloomed. The bloom made a baby sun in a window, and the baby sun drew 3 lines to itself from the corners of the room like wet hair to a drain. The person inside blew it out hard so the curtain wouldn't catch. In the glow's last shiver, the lines grew arms and then lost them again, and the curtain did not burn, which felt like mercy. I sat on the bathroom floor with my back to the tub and listened to my house try not to make light. The refrigerator tried a false start once, and I killed it at the plug again. The smoke detector's angry chirp for attention came, bright and petty. I covered the LED with a square of tape until the chirp learned I would not feed it. The router only knew one way to live. I threw a towel over it the way you throw a towel over a birdcage when you want your day back. Through the hall, a slice of pale slid along the baseboard and vanished, slid back, vanished again with the timing of a car turning onto our block, and then off. I held still. The blinds made their counting click, slow and uneven, as something outside tested the window like a tongue finding a broken tooth again and again, not biting, just remembering where the edge is. A child cried one house over, a desperate little yip like a seal. The sound cut off, a whisper followed, a parent's whisper with terror pasted over comfort, saying shh over and over without believing in it. Their living room gave a wash of dim like a fish tank without fish and then went dark again. I could see, in the wash, hands pressed to a coffee table, a rectangle of aquarium glass that did not attract what the lamp did. For once, glass did not want. The first lightning was so far away it lit the undersides of our few clouds like a bruise. No thunder yet. Just that dumb southern suggestion, it might storm, the air says. It might rain and you might be forgiven for everything. The flash rolled across our block like a tide, and every dark sheet we'd been pretending not to see stood up at once. Not long enough to go anywhere, just long enough to count how many. The street looked occupied, not with people, with presences built by angles. When the light left, the occupied thing sat down and pretended to be oil again. I saw it even with my eyes closed, which felt like cheating. The second lightning came closer and with a sound in its pocket. The thunder wasn't the long roll. It was a clap, mean and quick, like the sky slapping itself awake. Every window in the circle flared white, and every sill attracted a face someone had never loaned theirs to. The creep of black up the siding quickened, and then lay down again when the white left, a cat pretending it had not been on the counter. "Stay away from the windows," I said, and only I heard me. Rain finally arrived, the sudden kind summer throws like a bucket. The puddled oil on the asphalt became literal water that ran to the drain at the curb like a throat clearing. The noise softened the street, the way rain does, turning edges into breaths. It should have made things safer. It didn't. The rain took what light remained and broke it into a million pieces, beads that rolled and pooled and made islands all their own. Headlights swept the circle slow, the deliberate speed of someone looking for an address or for a person they love. The beams hit 1,000 raindrops and multiplied, turned our cul-de-sac into a planetarium where shadows could launch. In those scatterings, they did. They leapt from drop to drop like acrobats with infinite nets. They crossed where there had been no seam and used the seam the rain made. They gathered on wet hood paint and turned it into mirrors that weren't mirrors, just planes. They tried the undersides of porch steps where water glowed and found thin landing sites there too. The car made its second lap, slower, and I had the thought that it was the mother of the boy from the lot, and then shoved that thought out because thinking it doesn't help. The beam swung across my blinds, and my blinds scrolled, and the bottom slats knocked into the pillows I'd built, like something lives behind them that might care. I crawled to the living room and lay on my stomach with my face to the floor, because the picture of a head in a window is an invitation, and because the floor felt like earth, and I wanted earth. The house recited itself to me in vibrations, a drip in the sink like a metronome. The rain scattered applause on the cheap shingles, the faint mouse of something trying the back door's weather strip and being denied not by me, but by the angle of the light. I imagined the strip's little glow line under the deadbolt alive again and pulled my mind's hand back from that picture like from a stove. Down the street, a generator died. The quiet its death made felt like losing power during a symphony. Another lightning flash, another instant sense of wrong. This time I saw not just bodies unowned, but the way they preferred edges. The lip of the curb, the stair nosing, the cap of the fence. When the thunder came, it shook the loose slats of my blinds into a chime, and the thing outside my window, raked a fingernail up the vinyl like a chalk test. The nail made no sound. The vinyl complained for it. A neighbor cracked his door to yell at the sky with a sheet around his shoulders like a king whose castle leaks. The seam under his door filled with hallway light and threw a stripe. Even tired lightning knows to aim for stripes. A long, narrow rush of dark sluiced toward it, fast as surprise, and his bare foot hit the stripe, and he left the kind of print no mop will fix. He stumbled backward, sheet skidding. He slammed the door and tore the hall bulb out by hand, I think, because the stripe died mid-syllable. The long rush that had been so eager lost its only place to rise and went uninteresting as if insulted. I worked through the rules like rosary beads in my head. Light makes it strong. Flicker makes it take. Seams are doors. Bright planes are ladders. Rain makes more ladders. Lightning is a drum beat, and each beat lifts an army for exactly one beat. Darkness is refusal. Darkness is a spine. The officer called something to a house that didn't answer. The words skated along the wet and came back thinner. He was making rounds like a shepherd without a dog. He knew not to use his flashlight. He kept one hand on his belt anyway, the way men do when they need to think their tools are worth something. Rain softened to a tap. The storm wandered off in slow complaint. The sky went back to black with texture. In the quiet after, you could hear the little streams at the curb carrying leaves and a sock, and one dropped, plastic toy soldier, to the storm drain at the corner. On the drain grate, water glowed where the street lamp still touched it. The glow built a thin archive of every shadow that passed over it. In the corner of my eye, the archive moved like fish in a hatchery. The trucks came back one at a time, then in a cluster, then in a string. They'd found the note and argued with it. The far end of the street flickered once in a way like a test, and then held. The crew didn't bring the light towers this time. They came with hands and tape and the kind of fear that makes men very precise. The foreman stood in the rain without noticing he was wet and said one by one, "No surges, no." He didn't have a verb for no. I sunk deeper into the house's belly and breathed shallow. Every time a pole came on the old way, a heartbeat of dim, a climb to steady, my windows recited the lesson. The detached shapes didn't sprint this time. They arrived. They waited at the edge of steady light like wolves taught to sit. When a lamp shimmered the smallest amount, 2 tree lengths away, that pack stood at once and went to it with the great good joy of obeying their nature. The crews made it 3 poles down before a man got caught again. He knew not to step into a cone. He stepped across the thinnest chalk of it, just the faint lift you get where brightness meets debris, and it fixed his boot as if nail-gunned. He wriggled and cursed with the vocabulary of a man whose day has gone from bureaucracy to myth. 2 others slid into dark and dragged him by his harness back into the safe. His arms came. His leg took a long, thoughtful second to belong to the same plan, and someone wept, not him. I crawled to the bedroom on the house's backside and lay with my ear to the carpet, finding the long, low rhymes of the grid, the crew, the rain. My mouth had the taste of coins and tape. I tried to measure time by thunder and failed, then by the number of breaths between each pole's coming on, and stopped counting after I saw how bad my math is when I'm afraid. When the last pole on our circle failed to light at all and stayed in obedient dark, I understood the kind of grace engineers don't like. Leaving a thing broken can be the fix. 23 billion sulked in a halo, not white, not altogether dead. The men left it. They chalked an X on its base in a handwriting bright enough to read even by the old yellow, and rolled their string of trucks out with reverse beeps that sounded far, then near, then far again, as they zigzagged through the maze of other streets. The cul-de-sac remade itself into something that could be stood in. Not walked, stood. If no one made a pool, nothing gathered. If no one made a stripe, nothing crossed. A neighbor coughed behind a curtain, and even that felt like a light you could cover. My eyes closed and didn't rest. When they opened again, the house was a fraction paler. That gray that happens not because the sky is generous, but because it stops punishing quite as hard. Not dawn, not yet, just the thought of it. That thought was a light of its own. On the living room wall, the faint squares the blinds always make at this hour ghosted back in. They were so weak a person with a decent soul would have forgiven them. The thing outside my blinds did not have a soul, decent or otherwise. It pushed its palm against the slats, like a note slid under a door. I went to the kitchen and drank water and made myself chew a dry cracker so my jaw would remember it belonged to me. The faucet's little sparkle on the stream died when I cupped my hand, as if my palm were a lid. When full morning finally arrived, it did it the way it always does after a heavy night, too bright, too honest. Daylight is a hard light. It flattens everything but doesn't turn it hostile. The shadows it makes are near feet, near hands, near truth. The block looked like a place again, a bad place, but a place. The shoes still sat on the step, and they did not vanish in sun. The skateboard leaned in my kitchen like a borrowed confession. The note on my phone read like something written by someone I'd like to have met sooner. I stood at the window and watched nothing happen for a long time, and then I drew a line from this hour to noon and saw how I could live between them without stepping into any light I didn't choose. Daylight didn't make me brave. It made the rules simpler to hold in my hands. The sun was high enough to squash the worst of the angles. Where a porch would have made a ladder at night, morning made a square at a man's feet and then took it away the next second like a stingy dealer. The hard edge of the world softened just enough that I could think. I washed my face at the sink and watched the stream run clear without sparkling. The little triangle of the nightlight was still upside down in the basin, a dumb talisman that had saved me more than the lock on the door. On the kitchen table, I spread a paper map from the junk drawer like a relic. The phone could get me to the highway faster and cleaner, but the phone was an invitation every time it breathed. The map smelled like pencil shavings and dust. I traced a line with a fingernail out of the circle, north on Crest Line, east on Pine, cut through the park's ball field, then stayed at the median along Route 7 until the shoulder became a serious thing. At noon, shadows go short. At noon, even bad light has to flatten the world honestly for a minute. If I moved then, and only then, and never stepped into any man-made pool, I could cross the teeth of this place before the mouth closed again. I packed like a coward and like a soldier. Water, 2 bottles, crackers, a pocket knife for the kinds of problems knives actually solve, rope, tape, fear. The skateboard leaned against the cabinet, and I looked at it too long. I wanted not to carry it, and didn't know how to put it down in a way that wasn't leaving something behind. I slid it into the hallway, then into the garage, then back again, because the garage door had a weather strip with a memory, a glow that wanted to be fed. I ended up laying the board by the front door and hating it and loving it and leaving it. I wrote a note because some part of me still thought notes mattered, leaving at noon. North on Crest Line, east on Pine, ball field, RT7 shoulder. Don't turn on lights. If you're reading this, face the sun. I propped it against a mug on the table where no stripe would find it. On the street, the shoes hadn't moved. The officer's cruiser sat where it had ended up, a little crooked, white door scarred with the streak of last night's rain dirt. Either he'd left in the dark like a smart man, or he was asleep somewhere in the interior of it like a stubborn one. A city sawhorse sat near the mouth of the circle with a paper sign taped to it, no through traffic, electrical cruise. The sign's arrow pointed toward nowhere useful. I cracked the door at 11 and watched the cul-de-sac through the thin slice of wrong. The lamps were dead except for 23 billion sulk. Daylight humbled even that. Its coin looked like a stain someone would scrub at tonight. The road glared a little where the sun hit the water left in the gutter. I waited because impatience is a kind of light. I waited until the seam on my kitchen tile was more a suggestion than a stripe. When I stepped onto the stoop, I did it with my eyes on the ground, not the sky. You don't need to look at the sun to love it. You just need to stand where it is overhead enough to keep you from growing a tail. The neighborhood had a morning after smell. Wet dust, cut grass, hot metal. A drip ticked from the gutter end cap at the corner of my porch, regular as a clock. I moved in the dark between things. The trick, I realized, wasn't to avoid light altogether. The trick was to avoid light that had an edge. You could stand in broad day and be a person. You stepped into a pale thrown rectangle, and you became a thing that made the rectangle interesting. Mrs. Sue's cat poster had run ink. Midnight's face was a fuzzy double now, black on black. Below it, someone had taped a fresh sheet, community meeting canceled, in letters that had been too furious to spell straight. The board itself had a gloss. The gloss made a small bright, and on that small bright the faintest gray writhed like gnats. I walked past without helping the gnats name me. The tight bun woman's shoes still nested on the step. In daylight they were obviously shoes. The laces had that morning crispness of being dry again after a rain. A line of ants had discovered the salt from tears or the sugar from whatever had been on her dashboard and were doing their work without superstition. I kept my eyes off their shadows and their efficiency. At the bend, 23 billions looked less like a sentient coin and more like hardware. Chalk X on its base, handprints where last night's men had grabbed the door. I crossed on the outside of the curve so if the sun threw anything I wouldn't be on a ledge for it. My shadow was a little blur at my feet. When I stepped wrong and it jumped to the left, my heart kicked and then settled again when the blur snapped back under me honestly. Honest shadows made me want to cry, and I let that want move through me and then out because I needed the rest of me to pay attention. Crestline felt like a place after a parade. Trash you could read like a story, paper plates ground into grit, a ribbon from someone's ponytail, the odd cigarette in its quiet, a child's plastic sword without any honor left in it. The houses had their blinds shut like a town that had agreed on one thing. A few doors stood open in that hard way, hinges craned, no hands making them be that way anymore. I called hello at one of them and got a house's reply, a cool throat of air and a smell like lemon cleaner and fear. Inside, a lamp had been knocked over and pointed its dead mouth at a couch. Even dead, the lamp made a precise circle where dust hadn't settled. The circle had the memory of last night in it, like a stain. I didn't step in it. I let the floorboards tell me what they understood. 4 strides to the kitchen, shoes on the doormat, dog dish dry, a magnet on the refrigerator that said laugh and might as well have said do not. I didn't go looking for bodies. This wasn't that story. The closest thing to a body was absence and shoe, and a skate deck and a shallow scrape on a wall where a palm had wanted to be a line. The absence was intolerable and also the only thing that let me keep moving. On Pine, the poles wore new caution tape like bad jewelry. Someone had stenciled little tags on them in orange, work order numbers, and the orange had made bright slivers on the metal that I didn't like looking at directly. I walked on the crown of the road where the sun hit flat and true. When I had to step under a maple that hadn't gotten the memo about where it could put its shade, I did it fast, heel to toe. Not because speed saves you, but because hesitation makes a shape. The convenience store lot at the edge of the neighborhood had become a shrine because we didn't know what else to do. Someone had laid a hoodie on the corner where the oval had been brightest. Someone else had set a bottle of blue sports drink up right beside it, like the boy would roll up and be thirsty. The floodlight over the door was off. The door's glass held the sun and turned the lot into a clean mirror for a second, and my feet tried to move around that hold, as if good glass could become bad light just by wanting to. Inside, the cashier from last night was working a broom at nothing. He wasn't sweeping. He was pressing the bristles into the tile the way a person presses their palm into a bruise. He looked up, saw me, then looked down again, polite and uninterested. "Don't," he said without heat when I reached for my pocket. "Cash only. The machine glows." "I've got water," I said, and showed him the strap on my pack like proof of intention. "Do you need—" He kept the broom where it was. "They put a cone on the spot," he said, and jerked his chin at the far corner of the lot. Someone had. A small orange triangle on a black base. Last night's caution frozen into daytime. The cone's shadow was a precise little triangle too. It looked harmless. I liked the cone because it said we saw this and hated it because it implied we contained this. The manager wants me to leave the lights on, he said. Says theft. I told him. He says theft. Don't, I said, and he didn't. The shadow of the broom handle lay short and pointed at nothing. The park's ball field was a relief, a prairie in miniature. The chain link made a million tiny squares, but the sun killed their edges. Bleachers sat and shone a little. A kid's bat had been left under one bench, aluminum, the kind of reflective I would have avoided last night. Today it was only aluminum. I stepped around the dugout roof's shadow and out into the open and felt, for the first real time in a day, like a rectangle wasn't hunting me. From the outfield you could see Route 7's heat shimmer, the little mirages that make deep puddles out of an August highway. Cars moved, not many, enough to count. There was a county truck at the shoulder with its yellow bar dead, and a man in a straw hat leaning on his shovel and not looking toward town. He had his body angled to use his own shadow as a patch for his eyes, and if I didn't love him exactly, I at least kept my line where his idea would touch mine. Between the park and the highway was a strip of cracked sidewalk and a run of ranch houses. Their carports made pooled shade even at noon. I went down the middle of the street. I could feel a kind of appetite in those pools, not sentient, not pointed at me specifically. Just hunger answering geometry. I checked the time by the bluntness of my own feet on the asphalt. When my shape lengthened a hair, I moved faster. Noon is a minute, not an hour, and I didn't want to be caught long enough to buy problems. At the corner before the on-ramp, a barricade had been dragged into place haphazardly, as if someone meant to do a job and then remembered something better to be and let it go. The sign read, "Road closed," and under it, in spray paint, "No lights after dark." The paint dripped in a way that made letters into fingers. A flyer about a boil order was stapled under the spray. It flapped in the little wind the highway makes by moving. I didn't touch either. The shoulder beyond the barricade had the wide gravel I wanted to be on. Past that, the median scrub grass could almost be a path. Beyond that, the big stores and their flat roofs and their fog of LEDs and parking lot lights and glass doors waited like an inland ocean of mistakes, and I had no interest in that ocean. I wanted the county line sign, the industrial stretch after, the farm road dotted with a mailbox every half mile. I wanted a place where a lamp is a lamp and not a plan. Behind me, in town, the utility crews had started again on some other block. I could feel it the way you can feel someone turning on a television in a house you're not in. A rise in the registers, a brightening where the eye doesn't look but the body does. The men were doing something close to good, and good in this, at that hour, made a little weather. I didn't have it in me to be angry. I had in me only the intention to be somewhere else when they did it again tonight. I thought about releasing a message that made rules and decided I wasn't a prophet. I thought about knocking on doors and decided anyone who could be saved would not open one right now. I thought about the shoes and the board and the way the light makes a line and the way a line invites, and then I thought about the white fence rails along the highway ramp and how they cast friendly little stripes. I did not step in any of those stripes. From the bridge over the drainage ditch, I looked down into the water. It moved thin over concrete. It shone in long slits where the sun found it. In those slits, the shadows of the culvert's lip and the weeds made the simplest picture of last night's problem, black hugged bright like oil hugs a feather. It wasn't dramatic. It was accurate. I memorized it as a note to a future I could afford. A siren went past on the highway, a long official yowl that diminished into a tired Doppler. It took a car with it that had its hazard lights on, and its driver's face gray with a kind of daylight that isn't noon. Up the shoulder, the county trucks man lifted one hand without taking the shovel off his shoulder. His palm was a sensible shape and it cast a sensible shadow, and both of those facts were a benediction. I crossed the on-ramp at the widest part. I did not jaywalk through anybody's careful brightness. My shoes crunched sang on gravel. The heat off the asphalt was much, and I took it greedily. At the top of the ramp, the guardrail threw a small shadow like a ribbon, and I did not put my foot in it. I closed my eyes for a second and held the map in my head where the median ran like a backbone down the length of this place, and saw not roads exactly, but the spaces between cones, the honest acids of noon, the little wrongs at corners, the places where a short shadow could ruin you if you pretended it was a game. From the median I could see back down Pine. The cul-de-sac was a shape a child could draw. 23 billionths coin was a stain. Porch lights were off like the backs had been turned to a bad guest. It looked survivable if you didn't know. I knew I wasn't coming back for a while, maybe ever. That thought hit like guilt and like an antibiotic. A man on a bicycle came up the shoulder from the other direction, hat brim low, basket empty. He didn't look at me. We shared the median for a heartbeat and then passed. As he rolled under a street sign, his shadow lay briefly honest under him, and I fought the urge to salute it. I stepped off the curb and into the median, and kept my weight on the places where the sun had no patience for tricks. The median held like a spine. I kept to the gravel between the twin streams and let the sun press everything into a simpler picture. The highway signs cast their fat green rectangles on the asphalt to my right. In those rectangles, the bolts that fastened the panels to the gantries made tiny, sharp stars. I didn't step anywhere those stars landed. I didn't look up at the words. Words don't help when the light writes its own. Past the first overpass, the shoulder widened. A man in an orange vest hammered a steak for a county crew and squinted at me like I was a deer using the wrong corridor. "Sidewalk's dead," he said, then seemed to realize what he'd said. "Road's open. Watch the..." He gestured at everything. He had a salt line drawing on his jaw and a patch on his vest that read M. Duff. I nodded and kept my feet centerline on the hot dirt where noon made everything honest. The gas station on the corner had all its pumps wrapped in black trash bags, fluttering like headless things. The canopy lights were off and still the pooled shade under them looked like a trick. A girl behind the glass had taped a handwritten sign, cash only, power off after 7, no lights. She watched me from behind a rack of gum with her phone off in her hand, like the muscle memory of holding it mattered. The canopy's metal undersides made a dull, tempting bright where the sun found them. In those slivers, thin gray tried to stand and couldn't. The weak attempt was enough to make me cross wide. Beyond the station, Route 7 went flat and straight toward the county line. Warehouses hunched in a row like teeth worn down. Their loading docks made long caves even at noon. A forklift beeped inside one, asterisking the air with warning. I hugged the median harder, put the bright asphalt on my right shoulder the way you put an ocean on your left when you're stubborn about direction. A semi rolled past slow enough that I could see the driver's arm hair. The big mirror on his rig flashed sun into the ditch, and for an instant made a clean sheet down there. A slick shape threatened to climb it, and gave up, too weak at this hour to finish. I let my next step land solid and felt grateful for physics like it was a person. At the next intersection, a temporary light tower sat idle in a rental yard, cables coiled like snakes sleeping. The thought of them waking up at dusk made the muscles in my back go rope tight. On the chain link, a banner flapped, night work, LED conversion. My tongue stayed quiet because saying anything about conversion wouldn't make it a smaller word. A dog trotted across the median from a neighborhood that wasn't mine. It stopped when it saw me, ears turned like radar. Its coat was the same dun as dust. No collar. It watched my hands and my feet, and then the day above us, making its own rules. When a breeze threw the shadow of a signpost across its path, It detoured without making a production of it, like a dog who'd been yelled at for stepping in paint earlier this week. We both kept going. I crossed the on-ramp at the place where the white hash marks were faded into more suggestion than stripe. The sun ate the edge there. My shoes sank into gravel like approval. 2 miles on, the county line appeared with a sigh. Just a green sign the size of a cupboard door, riddled with pellet dents. Under it a mailbox leaned. Inside it a nest of flyers thick enough to turn a spark into a plan. No one had lit anything there. The scrub on the far side was low, scabbed with lichen. Beyond that, a cluster of oaks hard enough to throw decent shade on a bad day, and today wasn't bad. The state trooper at the line had the look of a man who'd been told to block and hadn't been told why. He parked nose out, sunglasses hiding the part of his face that might betray religion. A barricade angled across the side road into town. Sawhorses with flapping reflective strips that made little bright fish when trucks passed. I didn't step in those fish. "Ma'am," he said when I drifted toward the shoulder he was pretending to own. "Where you headed?" "Past the farms," I said. "A rental out that way. You got a reservation?" He said it like he knew how insane it sounded. I shook my head. He scratched his jaw, then his radio, then the itch that lives under everyone's belt. "Curfew at dusk," he said. "Stay put when it gets dark. They're asking people not to use lights after sundown. County issued guidance. People are using candles." He let that hang. He'd seen some things candles do. "No candles," I said. "I'm not turning anything on." He looked at my pack. "You know something, or are you just making a good guess?" "Yes," I said. It was as honest as I could be. He tipped his chin and stepped back from the seam his own door shadow made on the asphalt, like he could feel it tug. "Okay," he said. "Move while the sun's on your side." I did. The farms past the line were the kind that had lost a generation but kept a stubborn acre. There were pastures without animals and fields with weeds that had gotten their first big cheer in June and now, in August, were dying pretty. A hand-painted sign in front of a gray farmhouse read room month-to-month call, no number, just the paint, the implication. A second sign below it said cash, in letters too neat for anger. I turned down the gravel lane because the trees at the far end made one big shade I didn't want to get caught under alone later, and it's not a bad thing to have a person tell you how many windows a place has. The house had a porch with a swing that would break your tailbone if you fell asleep on it. No street light at the road, no light of any kind at the mailbox. Wind chimes that looked like they'd quit 6 owners ago. A woman sat on the steps with a coffee she wasn't drinking. She wore the tired a person wears when she has lived through everyone else's nights without meaning to. She watched me walk up in the sun, and then watched where my feet were relative to the slice under her eaves. "Don't come up," she said, not unkind. "I can hear you fine from there." "Day rentals?" I asked. My voice sounded like its own stranger. "I've got cash. You and everyone," she said, and then softened it with a sigh. "Room over the garage, no power after dusk, no smoking, no phones on at night." Hear me say it out loud and nod so I can see you nod. "I won't make light," I said, and nodded where the sun could bless it. "I'll tape the fridge. I'll tape the oven. I'll throw a tarp over the pilot. I won't strike a match." "Good," she said. "You'll want to cook before sunset. Heat carries. It's worse under fluorescence. It's something about the—" She lifted her hand and let the sentence choose not to finish. "You'll figure your own rules. It's $100 a week, $200 deposit. You break things, you leave them broken." I counted out bills with my thumbs so the little reflection off the ink didn't become more commitment than money is supposed to be. She kept her hands in the shade of her own knee until I set the cash on the 3rd step. Then she took it and slid it under a busted flower pot without looking like she cared who was watching. "Bathroom's inside the house," she said. "You can use it before sunset. After, you do what the stars do. When you can see them, you can see." "What about the road?" I asked. "Any crews out here?" "They're busy with town," she said. "We get co-op power. Lines go down when a squirrel sneezes. We used to be mad about it." She stared at her cold coffee. I can live, Matt, or I can live. You can use the room, or you can keep walking. The county line doesn't protect anyone from anything but budgets. The room, I said. I'll take the room. She stood without using her hands and pointed me around the side because the porch was a stripe I didn't need. The garage apartment had a dormer window and a door at the top of a set of wooden stairs. The stairs cast narrow bars onto the gravel. I took them slow and honest, heel to toe where the sun could kill the rungs. The room itself was simple: bed, table, a tiny kitchen with a gas stove whose pilot I could smell, and a ribbon of blue tape already over it like someone else had promised. A window unit air conditioner sat in the corner unplugged, a dead shrine to comfort. On the table, someone had left a roll of black trash bags and a page torn from a magazine. On the page, a list in ballpoint: cover LEDs, flip breaker 6 p.m., cook midday, wash midday, no mirrors. That last word scratched through hard enough to tear the paper. Like an afterthought, we both knew, even if nobody had to say it. I taped everything. The microwave, the router someone had idiot installed up here, the power light on the surge protector, the cheerful blue eye on the coffee maker. I flipped every switch once in daylight to see what it thought it would be later, and then taped them down in the off I swear position. I pulled the trash bag over the window unit and duct taped its mouth so it wouldn't breathe a glow. I hung a quilt over the dormer window. The quilt was heavy and fit like an old answer. When I was done, the place looked like a crime scene against brightness. It made me feel capable. I cooked it too: eggs in a pan, toast in a cast iron with a metal rack, because the toaster's red coil is a kind of light you don't think about until you've watched what light does. The heat climbed anyway, and the tiny room took it into its shoulders. I ate standing up at the table, knees against wood. The woman knocked once and slid a ceramic water pitcher through the door without stepping into my shadow. "Well, water," she said. "It's cold after the pipes sit. Drink before the metal tastes like the sun." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Night's long. People leave after 1. I keep the deposit. That helps my feelings. If you leave, don't use my porch light." "I won't," I said. She nodded in a way that didn't take my word as anything more than a sound, and stepped back into the authority of her shade. I tried to sleep an hour, not because I was tired, but because my body needed to practice being safe on purpose. I lay on the bed on top of the quilt with my shoes off and my pack as a pillow and the map under my hand. Cars on the highway rode a hum across the distance that was gentle in day and a threat at night. In a field beyond the tree line, something big, cow or wind, stirred long grass into a pattern my eyes couldn't help solving. I stopped them. I slept 15 minutes and woke with my heart doing the wrong thing, then told it the rules again, and it listened. At 5:30, the light changed in a way my skin understood before my eyes. The sun fell out of throat, the shadows grew their necks back. The woman banged once on the garage below with a wrench like a bell for vespers. I stood and walked the perimeter one more time, hand on tape, on bag, on unplugged plug. I turned the stove's gas knob to 0 and then 0 again. I flipped the little breaker in the closet that killed the apartment circuits and listened to the last hum of the last transformer in my head fade out. The air went honest and dumb. Dusk makes a liar of everything. It almost made me turn the lamp on to see the tape better. My hands remembered the half shell of a switch under my thumb and didn't push. I sat at the table with my elbows in and counted my breath like I owed it taxes. Through the quilt over the window, the world went from gold to a kind of bruise to the color of lid skin when you press your eyes too hard. A car went by on the county road and didn't slow. A cricket wound itself up to a pitch that invented 8 p.m. It was not quiet. It was right. She banged the wrench again at 6 and then again at 7. 2 notes I took as doctrine. The last you're allowed before any light in this place becomes something else entirely. I sat and did the math of how long a person can sit. I lay down when my tailbone asked me to. I drank water in small mouth caps. I ate one cracker because fear is a thick thing to swallow and salt helps. I did not touch my phone. I did not touch my phone. I did not touch my phone. At full dark, night arrived with both palms open. I felt it take one step up the wooden stairs and stop because I had not invited it in with a rectangle for a foot. In that dark, I could be anybody. I chose the one that used less light than a moth. I dreamed nothing. I didn't dream at all. I lay awake in the kind of black that restores or kills and let the crickets fill in the shapes that light used to own. When something touched the dormer window on the other side of the quilt, a soft graphite not sound like a pencil testing paper, I did not move. It moved again, a little up, a little down, measuring without mass. The quilt didn't lift. The glass didn't glitter. There was nothing for it. I slept in pieces. When a coyote sang, the hair on my arms stood and then lay down. When the county truck went by with its bar dark and its driver's eyes on the exact patch he needed to see to keep the world honest, I didn't look through the quilt to watch. I lay there until the room turned the first wrong gray of almost morning, and then the full right pale of noon to come. I lay there until the pattern made by the quilt stitching on the dormer square told me I could stand. I stood and flipped the breaker back with a hand that trembled and then steadied. Nothing came on. That was the point. I boiled water on the stove by opening the gas only when the sun had climbed above the barn roof and lighting it with a match in a circle of midday that touched nothing else. The flame's blue tongue made no shadow. I ate eggs again and they tasted right. After breakfast, I walked the lane and looked back toward town. The horizon above it had a different color to it now, a bruise that doesn't belong to clouds. Even at noon, even where I stood far from anything that hummed, the thought of that color tickled my teeth. On the gravel at my feet, my shadow lay so close to me it was almost not a thing at all. I am not going back. If the co-op runs a new line down this road, I'll ask them to stop at the old oak. If someone knocks after dark, I will not open. If noon ever fails to flatten the world honestly in this place, I will keep walking until it does. The woman on the porch banged the wrench twice at 6 again that night, and I sat in the black with my hands folded, counting my good breath and the minutes between the sounds outside that never needed me to see them.